Senate have shown zero interest in reopening the government. And I don't think they'll access, and a lot of people disagree. I've been saying for the last 30 days, we've had 4 or 5 different points. Yes, sir, they're going to get it right now. We should have it done in a day. I've heard that about 4 times. I heard it after Kings. You know, they said I was a king. And I heard it after Kings. I heard it after a couple of other moments in time. And I said, no, I don't believe so. And now I heard it's after the election. I don't believe so. I think they will. I think they're kamikaze pilots. I just got back from Japan. I talked about the kamikaze pilots. I think these guys are kamikaze. They'll take down the country if they have to. So I don't think so. Millions of Americans are going to be without SNAP benefits. And I will say about SNAP benefits, so when I was president, we had $7 billion worth, and now they have many times that, because these benefits were given to anybody that asked. And they're up to, I hear, just many times, 47 billion. So it wasn't the purpose of SNAP. It was for people that really had problems, down and out, people that really had problems. But during Biden, they gave it to anybody that wanted it. I think it's something you have to talk about because the numbers are incredible. But countless public servants are now not being paid, and the air traffic control system is under increasing strain. We must get the government back open soon, and really immediately. We have to get it up. We have the hottest economy we've ever had. And it's affecting the stock market now a little bit. But the stock market, as of Friday, has hit many record highs during the last 9 months, many. And it will again. This is just the beginning, because when these plants that are being built right now start opening up, we've never had anything like this. There's a boom. There's a construction boom right now, but that's going to be bigger than that. That's going to be an economic boom as soon as they open up, and it's going to be something special. We have car companies coming in. When I was in Japan, Toyota, Mr. Toyota, I said, "What's your name?" "Toyota." I said, "Oh, you're rich." I said, "How much of the company do you own?" 92.1%. I said, "I'm glad you said the one who wants to be." I said, "You're a rich guy." And he said, "I'm investing $10 billion in the U.S. And you know what I'm talking about, right? You introduced me, Mr. Senator. You introduced me originally when you were the ambassador to Japan. He's still
the President of the United States hosting a breakfast at the White House this morning alongside Republican senators to reflect on the events of the last night and, of course, to discuss a record-long government shutdown. I want to check in on the bond market. Bond market looks like this morning across 2s, 10s and 30s as we get some headlines on Treasury refunding. Bond yields so far higher just a little bit, 358 on 2s, on 10s, 4.09%. With the latest, let's cross back over to Bloomberg's Mike McKee for more. Good morning, Mike.
Good morning, John. We're out with the Treasury quarterly refunding numbers. Treasury is going to auction a total of $125 billion. That is in line with estimates, and the breakdown is as follows: $25 billion in 30s, $42 billion in 10-year notes, and $58 billion in 3-year notes. Those auctions go off next week, and we shall see whether they have to increase bill sizes over the course of the quarter, because the question is, will they be borrowing enough given the fiscal trajectory of the United States? We did see on Monday's borrowing needs announcement that they lowered the amount they thought they would have to borrow this quarter and in the first quarter of next year. But $125 billion is the total, and that is pretty much as expected.
Mike McKee with the latest. Michael, thank you. As expected, Graham, over your take on this one.
Honestly, I think this is going to be interesting. When do they actually start to make the transition that everybody is expecting, which is more heavy issuance on the front end of the yield curve? We're not seeing it yet. People keep saying, we're going to see it, we're going to see it. Right now, it's pretty much in line, and you are not seeing that doubling down in the maturity profile of the United States debt just yet. At what point do they have to, though? I think that is what a lot of people are wondering.
We get some bill buying next year from the Federal Reserve, right? In the next few months.
Still call it quantitative easing.
It's not QE.
It's not QE.
It just looks kind of like QE.
It just is.
Not QE.
Not QE. Well, it's the idea, if you haven't caught up, it's the mortgage-related debt, the issuance the Treasury, the Federal Reserve is holding. They're going to let that roll off, and then they're going to buy T-bills instead. So it's a supportive aspect for the T-bill market, and maybe not so much.
It's changing the composition of the balance sheet.
Exactly.
We're calling it that. Okay.
That's
Matt Hornbeck and Mike Aikman are going to break this down for us in just a moment.
Yes.
As we stick with the data, as traders look for clarity on the path ahead for rate cuts, the team at Morgan Stanley writes the following: we maintain our call for an additional 25 basis point cut in December. But the key question is what the data the Fed will actually have before December. A prolonged shutdown is a risk to our view of more consecutive cuts. Mike April and Matt Hornback at Morgan Stanley. Join us now for more. Gents, good to see you both. Thanks for being here.
Morning.
Mike, we're going to come to you first. The data, we don't have much right now.
No.
This government shutdown, it makes it less likely we get rate cuts in December, is that right?
Well, I think we're just reflecting what Powell said, that if you're driving a car in the fog, you should slow down. So he was saying there is a case to be made where if you don't have the data, maybe you can't act. My view would be that if we're still in December and the shutdown's in play and we don't have the data, I'd be really surprised if the Fed doesn't cut. I think the drag from a government shutdown at that point could mean growth is essentially zero in the quarter. And I would be surprised if there weren't some spillovers in the limited data that we see. So I think if we don't have data, it's because the government shut down, and I think that probably still justifies a cut.
We'll get to that in just one second, but Michael, from the economic perspective, do you get the sense that this is an economy that needs rate cuts, especially given the fact that the slow growth, slow hire, low fire kind of churn has been going on for quite a while and may have a lot to do with other factors outside of just the trajectory of the U.S. economy?
Well, so we came into the year thinking, no, you probably don't need to cut rates this year, that you would want to ensure that any inflation rise from tariffs is transitory, and then we thought the rate cuts would come in 2026. So my view is maybe we don't need it. There's certainly a discrepancy between the data and the tension between the activity and the labor market data, but I'm not on the committee. I don't get to make the choice. The view is the balance of risk shifted and policy needs to be recalibrated. So they've made that decision. They want to move closer to neutral. And I'm just thinking the data will justify another step in that direction in December.
Matt, are you already seeing that is with respect to how the bond market is responding to recent weakness and this idea that it seems as though everyone's buying the transitory story again. They're just not saying the T word.
Well, it feels to me as if the market had to adjust its pricing for the December meeting based on what we got out of the meeting last week. But the market is also at the same time hesitant of completely taking the December meeting off of the table, because I think investors are starting to look at the bigger picture. They're saying, hey, 2026 might be a better year, but we have to get through the end of 2025 first. And the government shutdown is starting to slowly creep into the mindset of investors. And they're thinking, gosh, if the data do come in on the weaker side going into the December meeting, then the Fed should very well continue its gradual move back to a neutral stance.
Day 36, longest in history. The president is now talking to Senate Republicans, saying they should just blow up the filibuster in order to do this. Is there a line in the sand where the government shutdown will need to end for you to really think that December's back on the table because all that data will start flowing through again?
Well, I think to the point that Mike made, they're going to get some data. Even if the government does stay shut down for the next couple of weeks, we might not get as much official government data as we would like to get, but we will still get a set of economic data like the data that we got this morning. We'll get another round there, and we're going to get, of course, the state unemployment claims data as well. So they're going to have something to work with. And so, to us, it's ultimately going to be the totality of whatever they have in hand that will lead them to decide what to do in December.
Mike April, we've got the annex. That's what we can go on, and we can talk to corporate executives, and we've spoken to a few already this morning. One bank executive came on the program and said things are okay, better than okay. There's no real damage in our loan book, and we expect re-acceleration into the new year. This one's counter to the view that you have on the labour market. Can you just flesh out what you do expect to see in the labour market in the months to come?
Yeah, so there's certainly a tension in the data. The activity data is solid, AI-related spending, off the charts, upper income households doing well. You were emphasizing that in the previous segment. But the labor market data looks different. So our view is we're maybe a third of the way through the process of firms passing tariffs onto the consumer. So that's going to extend at least into the first quarter of next year. While that's happening, I think there'll be great reluctance to hire. We've seen that. The low hire, low fire labor market, the ADP report's very consistent with that. So while that's going on, we think the unemployment rate creeps higher. And we have the federal workers who took the early retirement package will be rolling off payrolls in October to the tune of about 150,000. So we think the unemployment rate could finish this year around 4.5, 4.6. And if that's, it's not a meaningfully higher move, that's still a very low unemployment rate, but the direction of that move, I think, is enough for a Fed chair who says he's now a little more data dependent to say, let's take another step. So modest deterioration, modest continued cooling is what we think that message will be out of the labor market.
Forgive me for referencing your old colleagues. I want to talk about Bank of America just a little bit. I want to talk about what Brian Moynihan's going to be discussing later on.
Hello, this is Dr. Paul Cottrell. Thank you for joining. We are live streaming on YouTube, on Rumble, and also my website, the-studio-reykjavik.com. In addition, we are simulcasting on X Spaces. Thank you for joining. I greatly appreciate it. Please share the links. Ask your social media to follow me. I do these videos for free, so if you could help support the work by sharing the links, make sure you subscribe to all my channels. I have YouTube, Brighteon, Bitchute, and Rumble. You can also follow me on X and GETTR, Substack, TikTok, and Patreon. Great ways to help support the work. In addition, I have great products on my website. I have ebooks, supplements that if you follow my protocol, you'll slow down the aging process and boost up your immune system, which is super important. And also course material on immunology and pulmonology. Please help support the work that I do by going to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. And if you'd like, you can be a paid member to my Substack, my Patreon channel. You can also donate on my website through Stripe, PayPal, or Buy Me a Coffee. There's lots of ways to support my work. I greatly appreciate it. If you follow my advice, you'll be able to navigate through the markets and make money, and also improve your health and wellness by getting the great products and stacking them the way I stack them. I've been doing this for a very long time. I've been focused on the anti-aging aspect of this protocol since I was 16 years old. All right. I've been doing this for a very, very long time. If you just pay attention to what I have to say, it will work. You just have to stick to it. So please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. We're going into the fall and the winter season. It's problematic. You know why. You have to boost up your immune system, and there are great ways to do this. One great way to do it is to get the Max 35. The Max 35 or the Cleanse. Cleanse is 30 parts per million. Max 35 is 35 parts per million. You take a teaspoon a day, swish in your mouth, gargle about 20-30 seconds, and then swallow it. What this will do is boost up your immune system, your innate immune system. You have two types of immune systems. You have an adaptive and an innate. This will help to boost up that innate immune system. It'll improve the oral cavity, help improve the oral pharynx, which is the back of your throat, maintain the mucosal barrier, and help the health of your epithelial cells in your oral cavity and your oral pharynx. Super important. If you're not feeling well, or someone around you is not feeling well, take a tablespoon or two a day. Swish in your mouth, gargle, and then swallow, right? 20 seconds. Now, once everything's all clear, then go back to your maintenance dose. I've been doing this for 5.5 years. So please go to my store, take this on a daily basis, teaspoon a day. If you're not feeling well, a tablespoon or two a day, and boost up that immune system. It's the first pillar of my overall anti-aging protocol. The foundation is a probiotic and a multivitamin, and then there are 4 pillars. The first pillar is the Max 35 or Cleanse to boost up that immune system. C60, very strong antioxidant, soak up free radicals. Third pillar is the turmeric, ashwagandha, lignans to boost up your immune system. And the 4th pillar to this protocol, Boomer Boost, to rev up your metabolism and increase your energy levels. And if you pay attention to that protocol, you'll notice that I'm targeting all the major components for aging. In aging, the aging process, you're starting to lose energy, and the health of the mitochondria starts to go down. Well, if you take the Boomer Boost, you're increasing your energy and you're improving your cellular metabolism. When you age, you start to build up free radicals. Well, you're soaking up those free radicals with the C60. When you age, your innate immune system and your adaptive immune system starts to go down. Well, you're targeting that with the Max 35, the Cleanse, the ashwagandha, the lignans, and the turmerics. Because when you're bringing down inflammation, you're helping to boost up your immune system. And a good probiotic and a multivitamin is going to help with gut health. You'll get better sleep, and you'll have better cellular metabolism. So if you've been paying attention to that protocol, you're targeting all the major ingredients, and you're going to be able to slow down that aging process. So please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Make sure that you get these great supplements, but make sure you use the discount. Discount 5 is $5 off in the order. All right, with that, job numbers came in, the ADP numbers came in a little bit better than expected, so that's positive, but we still have some issues with the market. Bitcoin is trading at 102. The VIX is trading at 19. And the futures is trading at 6,805 for the S&P 500. Now, this is my target for year end for the S&P 500. 6,850 to 7,000. There is probably the highest probability is going to be at about 6,900. But I don't see the market like falling off a cliff by year end. The reason why is they have to close the books for these investment houses, so they have marketing materials to try to convince new clients to invest in their fund. So they want to close the year out strong. So there's a high probability that it will be at an all-time high. So I think it's going to be closer to 6,900, maybe even 7,000. I'm a little concerned though in Q1 or Q2 of next year, but we want to see the price structure and then determine what to do. But I think that that's the range, 6,850 to 7,000 by year end. Now, some of the headwinds are something may come out of the White House about tariffs. Now, in terms of Bitcoin, I find it very odd that it's not trading closer to 120. It's trading closer to 100,000. So, what's going on there? I think that I think Bitcoin is manipulated. I think there's a manipulation of the market. Now, oil is trading at $60 a barrel. So I think what you're going to start seeing is there's going to be a trading range between 60, 59, probably around 59.50 to about maybe 64, a trading range for oil. The Euro USD is trading at 114. Dollar is strengthening a little bit if you look at maybe a 2-week movement window. The USD Japanese yen is trading at 153. The ones that have been paying attention to me, if you see yen strengthen, that especially if it gets closer to 140, that's bad for the international trade, and that may be a warning for our equities. But it's weakening. The Japanese yen's weakening, so that's good. That's a good signal for risk taking. The VIX is below 20, so that's good. So this is very positive as data points to suggest that we're going to be closer to the 6,900 mark by year end than below 6,800. Now, there's a support level at about 6,750, and right now our resistance level is 6,900 for the S&P 500. All right, with that, let's play Fox Business. As you know, Mamdani won, and New York is now run by a communist. He isn't sworn in yet. I'm not sure when the swearing in for the mayor is. But New York no longer is a capitalist city. It is a communist city. So what does that mean in terms of cost, in terms of housing, in terms of safety? A lot is unknown here, all right? He's not experienced, and I suspect that he's going to make the city worse off than de Blasio, and de Blasio did a terrible job. So let's just listen in here. This is Mamdani's victory speech, leaves viewers stunned. So it's only 6 minutes long. I think they're just playing snippets of the victory speech. Let's just listen in. I have not seen this video.
First, the hot topic of the hour. Democrats sweep major elections across the country last night, including in New York City's mayoral race and the governor's races in Virginia and New Jersey. Fox Business's Darren Botelho is live this morning in Washington with what comes next. Darren.
Hey, good morning, Maria. So I think we can say right now the polling turned out to be pretty accurate for those high-profile elections all down the East Coast. Democrats winning from New York down to Virginia, starting with Democratic Socialist Zoran Mamdani besting Andrew Cuomo, running on his platform of tax the rich and free public transit. Over the river to New Jersey now, Democrat Mikey Sherrill, a former Navy helicopter pilot, securing her win over Republican Jack Ciattarelli. Then finally, going down to Virginia, Abigail Spanberger reclaiming the governor's mansion for Democrats over Winsome Earl Sears. Mamdani, of course, as you know, the most controversial of the races, with the 34-year-old ending now, the Cuomo political dynasty, defeating former New York governor. So his 20-minute victory speech last night directly attacking the old political establishment, further pushing his far-left agenda and all but declaring war on President Trump.
If anyone can show a nation betrayed by Donald Trump how to defeat him, it is the city that gave rise to him. So Donald Trump, since I know you're watching, I have 4 words for you. Turn the volume up.
And Mamdani, who's been facing questions over his anti-police stances and accusations of
Think about this. You have Mamdani, who thinks he's like a tough guy now. Tough guy. He won New York. He's a mayor in New York now. He's a socialist. He's a communist. He's a democratic communist. And then Trump, who survived 2 assassination attempts, brought peace to the many wars that are happening. Now, will those peace agreements stay? I don't know. But President Trump has done a pretty damn good job as a president. And he's put into at least the top 5. I think he's in the top 3. Now, there are some things about Donald Trump I don't like. But overall, he's doing a pretty damn good job. Now, you got this Mamdani, who has no experience. Mamdani, I should say. Has no experience. And he's going to tell Trump to turn up the volume. All right, motherfucker. All right.
Won the race pretty decisively, with that race being called, Maria, only 40 minutes after the polls closed at 9 p.m. Maria?
Yeah, it was fast, Darren. Thanks very much, Darren Botelho, joining us this morning. Your reaction, Emily, Adam, what does that mean?
Well, turn the volume up. That was the strangest thing I think I've ever heard, because it makes no sense. I don't know what he was referring to. I'll tell you what does make sense. Here in New York, 1% of the population pays 48% of the income tax. Capital goes where it's treated best. If he is going to pay for all these handouts by taxing the wealthy, people are going to leave. And it wouldn't take a lot to completely upset the balance of payments here in New York City, because, again, 1%. You antagonize a quarter of that 1%, and it all implodes.
And you started to note it, and he's right about it. He used to work for Bloomberg. Now, he's right about that, because look at what happened during the COVID years, and there was an exodus out. The city had a major hole in its budget, right? Now, there were many that came back after, but the thing is that we already have data to show that when there is a flight out of the city, that the budget collapses. The funding collapses for the city.
For the election, we were talking about really how much power the mayor of New York really has to implement these things. Jeffries this morning on Wall Street out with a report telling their clients a couple of the things that he actually could do. Mamdani's proposals within mayoral authority include a broad latitude to advance policies affecting property owners and renewable energy and immigration, intensifying enforcement of housing codes, accelerating city fleet electrification, enforcing sanctuary protections, relies on the mayor's ability to issue executive orders. Emily.
Well, Mamdani's policies ultimately will fail if he's able to implement them. That already might be a failure there, but we know socialist policies fail no matter if he's able to implement them or not. And I want to point out that today, November 5th, feels dramatically different from last November 5th when President Trump won the popular vote, won 7 swing states. Now we have an anti-American, anti-capitalist, anti-police candidate who just was elected to run the financial capital of the world, to run the largest police force in the country, the NYPD, of course. Mamdani is going to be responsible for a $150 billion budget, 300,000 employees, and over 30,000.
Let me just get on my soapbox and start talking for a little while. Mamdani is 34 years old and not that educated. He doesn't know. You don't have to be going to an Ivy League school to be educated. You just have to know how to learn. He didn't learn anything about the warnings of Plato in the Republic, where it states that the masses, the plebs, will start to rise up through democracy and lead to tyranny. Well, Plato was right. But we don't have to go that far back to the Greek philosophers. We can go to John Locke, an Enlightenment philosopher, talking about life, liberty, and property, which is the foundation of our Constitution. He wants to control means of production and take away your property rights, which by definition is against the Enlightenment. So all those supposedly educated people, part of the intelligentsia, that are 45 years or younger, primarily in their 30s and 20s, that voted for him, they didn't even learn the basics about Greek philosophy, nor about the foundation of the Enlightenment. Then we can go to our founding fathers. While they were constructing the Constitution, it was about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because Benjamin Franklin was wise enough to tell Jefferson, you know what? Guess what? Maybe we don't want to say life, liberty, and just property, because there's something bigger going on. Pursuit of happiness. So he, Mamdani, is going to not only try to control the means of production, not only try to control your property and take away your property rights, he's trying to take away your pursuit of happiness. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Now, what socialistic country actually was prosperous? We already did the grand experiment. So we don't even have to go to the founding fathers. We don't have to go to the 1700s to find out where Mamdani went wrong. We can go all the way back to right after World War II, right after 1945, and look at that time between 1945 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, 1990s, early 90s. I think it was 91. Or 90, maybe it was 90. I'd have to double check, but either way, early 90s. So you have the 90s, you have the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, all right? And during that time period, the grand experiment happened. Western countries in Europe compared to Eastern countries in Europe. And the Eastern countries were under the Soviet Union. They were the satellite countries, where their manufacturing was dilapidated and creativity was stifled. Comparing it to the Western countries, where capitalism flourished. The grand experiment about capitalism versus communism was proven during the Reconstruction in Europe. And guess who won? It sure like hell wasn't communism. It wasn't Lenin. It wasn't Marxism. It was capitalism. It was Adam Smith, the invisible hand. It wasn't this controlled economy by Marx. He's a Marxist. America didn't grow under Marxism. America grew under Enlightenment, self-determination, capitalism. So these, not only this uneducated individual, Mamdani, but even the educated elite voted for this stupid ass because they didn't learn their history. They didn't learn the philosophers that paved the way to the great country that we have. Because you ask someone that's in their 20s or 30s why to vote for Mamdani in New York as a mayor. Oh, we need to try new things. Well, these new things that he's trying never worked out in any country. I think the book that paves the way to understanding this is what Rand Paul wrote recently about how socialism doesn't work. And he goes in detail about the different countries. That's a great read. Mamdani probably didn't read that book. Mamdani might not be even able to read. The bottom line is this. You had individuals that think they're educated, voting for a person saying they want change and not understanding the historical context that the change that they're looking for doesn't work. And it's been proven out. And it's also another concept here. If the city is too expensive for you, go to someplace else. Why destroy the city so you can try to live in it? Huh? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? If you can't live in an expensive area, that doesn't give you the right to force policies so you can live there. Go to a different place. New York really doesn't want the young. New York doesn't want these young, stupid idiots. We don't want you. But they just keep on flowing in. Now, if you look at the electoral map, a lot of people, the big margins that Mamdani was getting was in Brooklyn. The Brooklyn hipsters voted for this stupid ass. The Brooklyn hipsters. You know why? Because the Brooklyn hipsters, they're all fucking communists. They're all intellectuals, pseudo-intellectuals that think that they understand things. Yet Plato warned us of this type of person.
So I had a pit in my stomach last night when I heard Times Square erupt in cheers and cars honking, and I wish the best for New York.
Yeah, and there are things that he has proposed that are actually outside of his authority.
Yes.
One of those things is freezing rent. He says he's going to freeze the rent for stabilized tenants. That depends on an independent rent guidelines group,
Correct.
where the mayor's influence is indirect. So we don't know if he's actually going to be able to do that. Eliminating bus fares citywide requires the MTA to actually make that ruling and state approval. Now, Kathy Hochul may go with him.
Right.
That's fine, but he can't do that unilaterally. Raising corporate or millionaire taxes, revising property tax structures, and implementing universal child care all require Albany's approval. Again, Kathy Hochul backs it. So she may very well back all of this, but he cannot do that unilaterally.
No, he cannot do it unilaterally. And think about some of these proposals. Let's just talk about rent. Everyone here in New York complains, gosh, it's so expensive, whether you buy or whether you rent. Let's say you freeze rents. Well, if you freeze rents, then apartment owners are not able to effectively raise the rent to cover the cost of maintenance. What if the roof leaks? What if you have a problem with the plumbing? What if it needs, what if there are rats coming in and you need to have the foundation sealed? So what you're going to see is that there will be virtually no reinvestment, no capex, no capital expenditures to maintain the quality of property. So on the one hand, you say, oh, isn't it wonderful? My rent's not going up. Maybe even it's going down. Well, actually, no, it's not, because the quality of the building is going to erode over time.
That's true.
So
That's
there
true.
are these consequences.
If you're not gonna be able to recoup your costs, or to do, further renovations, these buildings are gonna start to decline. But it's beyond that, and Fox hasn't focused on it. The people that voted for him usually are transients. The far majority of the 20 and 30-year-olds that voted for Mamdani only live in fucking New York for 3 years. And then they leave. You know why? Because they can't afford it. Because they can't find a good job. Because they get kicked out. They work for a consultant company or for Goldman Sachs. And guess what? There's a high turnover. They can't make it. And they decide to go home. So what they do is they come here, try to make it. All they care about is being able to cut the cost for the years that they're here, and then they leave, and then the people that stay in New York have to pick up the mess. And this is emblematic of the millennials. Make a mess, and someone else has to clean it for you.
I don't think people have thought through. They hear the headline, rent's going down, great.
Who's paying for it?
Who's paying for
But
it?
again, freezing rent is outside of his mayor's
Correct.
authority. But again, it can't be helpful back to
Rent never goes down. It may go up slower than some years, or stay at a certain level, but it never goes down. This is crazy. People need to realize that there are a lot of transients that come into New York thinking that they deserve to be in New York, and then they realize they don't like the culture, they don't like, they can't handle the corporate grind, they don't like the cost of living. It's a different way of life. For sure. And a lot of people don't understand that. And so they're here, and they usually start breaking down in around 24 months, and then they get out in the third year, or after the third year. They're transients. And the ones that voted for Mamdani, of the educated, aren't even going to be here in 3 years. So they've created a mess, and people that have stayed here for many years or have been born here are going to have to clean it up. Because the self-centered millennials thought that socialism was a better idea. Meanwhile, in school, they're told that socialism's awesome. It's always free. Now, they're getting it from a tenured professor where the school can't get rid of them, and he thinks that his paycheck is just grown on trees. I'm telling you, millennials don't understand economics. Millennials don't understand the Enlightenment. The millennials don't understand philosophy of yesteryear. They understand Marxism, but they don't understand the aftermath of Marxism. Did they really do a deep dive analysis of what the hell the Soviet Union destroyed in terms of the economic prowess of the Eastern countries in Europe? Do they understand that? Don't they understand that the Soviet Union collapsed because of a failed economy? Don't they know that? Don't they get it? No, let's just bring communism to America. Why come to America? Now here's another issue that is really strange. I was at a painting unveiling, all right? And it dealt with a particular alumnus from Harvard back in the early 1900s, like around, I think it was 1913s, 1920s, somewhere in there, all right? Now, the painting is really done really well. The technical skill for the painting, very good. The particular subject, I'm totally against. I'm not going to say what it was about. But the thing is that the person represented something that I don't believe. But it's okay to be at an event and admire the technical skill of an artist, even though the subject matter is something that you disagree with, all right? It's okay to have a dialectic, all right? Now, what I am noticing in New York is that, and this subject was tied to Puerto Rico, all right? He had it was Puerto Rican nationalism, right? Okay, so with that, why come to the United States only to demonize it and not be aligned with the American flag, but your other country's flag? Why even come to the United States? Right? I have there's something wrong with that. There's something wrong with it. You can still have an affinity to your nationality, especially if you're an immigrant. But you're also, if you become naturalized, then shouldn't you be shedding your past and you're paving a way for the new future? And what's happening, I'm noticing, is that there are many, not all, but there are many people that are coming to the United States legally, but really are only here for the economic, and they don't really subscribe to the idea of the Constitution and of the country's ethos. They want to change the country's ethos. Then you layer in huge illegals coming to the country, not having an affinity to the country at all, the United States, but having affinity to their homeland. And they're trying to spoil the ethos of the actual country, of the United States. This is a big problem. This is a big problem here. And these individuals that I'm talking about are socialists. They want socialistic programs. They want to come here and get benefits from a great economy that was based on the Enlightenment, life, liberty, and property. And they want to take from it. They don't want to give to the country, build businesses, move the country forward into prosperity, be an explorer, be a pioneer. No, they're here to take. Now, not all immigrants are like this, but there are many that are. They're here to take. It's just take. It's not to give. Now, the ones that do give and shed that homeland ethos, those are immigrants that you should admire. The ones that are providing and giving to the United States through their ingenuity or their genius or whatever, or their hard work. But ones that are here, that are coming here legally or illegally, and they're here only to take, big problem. And almost all of them are socialist. Almost all of them are socialist. So what happens is that they come in, they destroy the society, and once they've destroyed it, once they've taken the fruits of capitalism and they destroyed it, then they go on their merry way like locusts. That's what's happening. You got these communists that are coming in and feeding on the crops of capitalism like locusts. And once they destroy it, then they go fly away to some other place. That's very emblematic of what I'm seeing with the transients in New York. You have these young, socialistic intellectuals or pseudo-intellectuals. They're like locusts that come in, they try to feed on it. They realize that it's a hard environment, and then they go fly away. But they do damage. They do damage to the crops of the capitalist.
Do it. The other thing is implementing city-owned grocery stores. That would need the city council legislation for the program creation and budget support. That's not in his realm of getting this done. If he gets the support, okay. Raising New York City's wage floor to $30 an hour by 2030 is governed again by state law. He's made a lot of promises, all of which are outside of his authority.
And can you imagine if minimum wage were raised to $30?
Wow.
I mean, minimum wage is supposed to provide some sort of floor for gig workers or temporary jobs. If you're going for a job that's got minimum wage attached to it, that's not intended to be a career. But he's trying to make it a career, $30. And guess what? Those jobs will disappear.
Well, we're going to talk all about this morning, what these new governor-elects as well as mayor-elect can actually get done. And we will also take a look at the state of these regions.
All right. Please help support the work that I do. All these videos are for free, and I'm telling you how to trade the market. All right. So please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the peppermint and the lavender structural nano silver soaps. You can also get them in lemongrass and charcoal tea tree. Very high quality soaps. Should use them year round, but especially during the fall and the winter. Why? Because it helps to neutralize. Another thing that you should be preparing for is stocking up with lozenges and drops. Why? Because of the fall and the winter season. The elderberry zinc lozenges, very high quality lozenges, and you can also get drops in the cherry flavor, blueberry flavor, and the honey and lemon. Get a few bags for your household. Be prepared. The moment you have that throat irritation, take the drops or the lozenges. It'll mitigate the problem. All right? This is a great way to navigate through the fall and winter season, and even during the allergy season in the spring. Please go to my store. Use discount 5. I want you to save some money. Discount 5, all caps, discount 5. Use it and get the great products that I offer on my store. And be prepared for the fall and the winter. Because if you keep on pulsing and getting sick, all right, it takes time for your body to heal. And the more often you're sick, the more chronic it is, the longer lasting the sickness is, the more damage it takes on your body, the longer it takes to actually heal. And if you notice that people are chronically sick, they age faster. So the whole idea here is to slow down the aging process and to get healthy. So if you take my advice, you will be healthy. So please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. And again, make sure you use discount 5, all caps, discount 5, and you get $5 off any order. All righty, let's listen into Bloomberg.
What was the biggest turnout in half a century vowing to tackle affordability with rent freezes, free buses, and higher taxes on the rich?
New York, tonight you have delivered a mandate for change.
A mandate for change and a new kind of politics. Oh, doesn't that sound like Lenin? Oh, wait a minute. Wait, yeah, it does. Doesn't that sound like Marxism? Oh, yeah, it does. Doesn't that sound like there's a big problem in Brooklyn? Yeah, it does.
How does that change how he governs as mayor?
Yeah, when I spoke with him yesterday, he told me that any win, any victory would be a mandate, but this was pretty decisive, right? It was a 9-point edge on Andrew Cuomo, and this was a race that was really defined by two different visions. One, a vision about affordability for New Yorkers, and another one, which was just basically running against Zohran Mamdani. That was Andrew Cuomo's vision. What we know is that he believes he has this mandate for change. How will he get it done? Well, he's already said this morning he is looking at working with Albany to get taxes raised on the wealthiest New Yorkers, and in addition to that, raising the corporate tax rate right now at 7.25%. He's saying raise that to 11.5%. It'll give $9 billion to his biggest proposals: free buses, universal childcare, and a freeze on the rent.
So is anyone moving out of New York, Miles? I mean, so many on the right even in the center, were so angry that Zoran Mamdani was getting so much attention, and they were saying he was going to ruin New York City. Is everything going to grind to a halt here?
You know, it is a different day in New York when you've got Bill Ackman congratulating Mamdani on his win and saying he wants to do anything he can to help make him successful in New York. You've got Jane Fraser and Jamie Dimon saying that they want to work with him on transit and on affordable housing. He's got to build a broad-based coalition to come here to City Hall with him. He'll occupy that office just down the hall in about 2 months' time. And he's got to get a transition team together that reflects New York City. Yes, his labor base. Yes, his DSA, Democratic Socialist base, but also Wall Street and business. Bring them to the fold and figure out how they can work together, because these proposals have to be funded some way.
In Mamdani's victory speech, he spoke directly to the president. He said, "President Trump, as I know you are listening." And President Trump likely was listening. In the middle of that speech, he put out on Truth Social in all caps, "And so it begins." What does this set up for tension between the President of the United States and the incoming mayor of New York City?
Yeah, you know, it's actually interesting. Let me take you back to when Joe Biden was president, right? He did not have a good relationship with Eric Adams. And so what happened? There was the issue with the migrant crisis happening here. Fast forward to this mayoral race. Andrew Cuomo was making the case that he was the only one who could fight Donald Trump. Mamdani and Donald Trump are going to go head to head, surely, because Donald Trump is saying he's not going to give federal funds to the city. That likely won't happen. There'll be lawsuits and all of that. But you got to think about what Mamdani has also said. Trump, in 2024, you ran on an affordability message. Can we work together on this? Can we work together on grocery stores or groceries being cheaper? Can we work together on, getting the costs down? He's going to try to figure out ways to work with Trump, but of course it's going to be a big fight when you talk about National Guard and immigration rates here in the city, something he won't stand for because that is his broad-based coalition that propelled him to be mayor-elect today.
All right, Miles, great coverage. As usual, Miles Miller there down at City Hall. Catch Bloomberg's special election coverage today, kicking off at 12 p.m. New York time on Bloomberg Radio and TV. Coming up, Nancy Tangler trimmed Google and added Palantir to her portfolio. We'll discuss the AI trade with her next. This is Bloomberg Open Interest.
Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the vitamin C and magnesium. Vitamin C and magnesium is dual purpose. It's going to help with the health of your skin, improve your immune system, and help with brain function. Like I've been saying, for people that are 40 years of age or older, because of the aftershock of the crisis in 2020, 30% of people that are age 40 or older will have early onset of dementia. And within that 30%, 75% of them will have ischemic issues, microclotting and microbleeding that will cause the dementia. 24.9% approximately will get amyloidosis, which is a buildup of plaque on the neurons. And about 0.1% will get prion disease. You better start protecting your neurons. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the vitamin C and magnesium. And also the magnesium and zinc. Magnesium and zinc will boost up that immune system and improve your brain function. Stack them together, especially during the fall and the winter, to boost up that immune system. In addition, magnesium helps to increase the efficacy of vitamin D3, which is also very important to take during the fall and the winter season. If you've been paying attention to me, you will do fine. You don't be surprised something bad happens. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Make sure you use discount 5 and you get $5 off any order. Or you can just, pay attention to Mamdani and just let your society go straight to hell with communism. Amazing. All right, let's listen into CNBC.
David Yearman. More meaningful with time.
Zohran Mamdani has defeated now Andrew Cuomo and Curtis Sliwa in the New York City mayoral contest. Joining us right now is Ed Schuyler, who's the head of enterprise services and public affairs at Citi. Previously served in the Bloomberg administration for both terms as deputy mayor for operations. And the big question now, I would ask, is how do you think the business community works with or doesn't work with this mayor? And to the extent that
I have to correct myself because I want to be as accurate as possible. The fall of the Berlin Wall happened in 1989, not 90. It was November 9th, 1989.
a number of wealthy folks and other businesses have threatened to leave the city, whether they do. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I don't think companies are going to throw their toys out of the crib and say, because I don't agree with this person ideologically, that we're just going to leave. I think they're going to look at the business environment as they have over the last couple of years. And I think that when you look over the last 5 years, what's gone on in New York City is that we've lost our competitive edge. Crime is still 25% higher than it was before COVID. The office vacancy rate is 5% higher than it was before COVID. 900,000 people have left over the 5 years. That's the population of San Francisco. So then the business community looks at those trends and then thinks about what are the policies that the mayor-elect is going to enact and how will that impact the business environment. But also what they really look at is what we saw firsthand is that in many ways, the job of the mayor is a management job. It's an operational job. The mayor is going to take control of the 300,000 person workforce. It's a $125 billion budget. It is a $1 trillion economy. And how he manages those agencies, builds a government, balances the budget, which right now is forecast to have about an $8 billion deficit for next year. Those are the things that the business community is going to be watching. His policy and proposals are aggressive. They require a lot of help from Albany. As gifted as a political communicator as he is, it's not clear he'll be successful in getting those through. But at the end of the day, he quoted Mayor LaGuardia last night during his acceptance speech. Mayor LaGuardia had said that there's no Democratic or Republican way to clean the streets. I think we're going to find out whether there's a capitalist or socialist way to clean the streets.
Well, that's the question, Ed. And, we had Robert Frank on just yesterday. He was talking actually about how when you look at the math, so much of the financial industries, financial services professionals, insurance professionals have ultimately moved to Texas, actually more in Texas than in New York now, in terms of thinking about, we all often talk about New York being the capital of capitalism. Even if Zohran Mamdani cannot pursue some of the most ambitious of his planks around taxes, corporate taxes, and individual taxes and the like, how do you think the rhetoric changes the dynamic for business in the city?
Well, I think he has some constituencies that he needs to reach out to. I think he had an opportunity last night to start doing that. I think he was very much talking to the room. But I think he also has to remember that while 50% of the people voted for him in New York City, which is impressive given a three-way race, 50% didn't. And he has constituencies inside of government and outside of government that he needs to reach out to. Within the government, he's going to manage the police department, which is experiencing attrition at the high levels. And he made very, to put it politely, statements in the past that were not supportive of policing and the police department. So he needs to build bridges internally, within that agency. Secondly, he's now the mayor of the largest Jewish population outside the state of Israel. And there are a lot of Jews that have, strong emotions about the result. And so it's another group of people that he needs to reach out to And I think that, whether you're in government or you're in the private sector, these are things that are important. And he has an opportunity in the next couple of weeks as he builds his government, as he goes out as mayor-elect. The campaign is over. It's now time to turn to governing, and it's now time to focus on the nuts and bolts of running one of the most important and dynamic city of the world.
I mean, you started in a very reasonable fashion, just presenting the facts and not in an emotional way. Mayor Bloomberg, I know he was a Republican, but I think of him more as a centrist and almost a Democrat in certain ways. For some reason, I think Democrats are almost whistling past the graveyard and they're turning and twisting themselves into pretzels to minimize his prior comments and to say, well, he was a young man when he said he wanted to seize the means of production. You've been very matter of fact about what he has proposed. Why aren't more Democrats frightened, like not Republicans, but like average people about what in terms of anti-Semitism and everything else? I mean, this is a walking, quacking duck that they don't call him a duck. They say he was either young or you ran a distorted campaign. I mean, this is frightening to a lot of people.
Well, I think that he brings an ideology to the job where most mayors do approach it as in a less partisan, less ideological fashion. Certainly Mayor Bloomberg did. Remind you, he was a Democrat before he switched parties.
Right.
And he's going to bring that ideology, and he was unapologetic about it yesterday. But if you
is there any way this has a happy ending, Ed, in your view?
Absolutely. I think you have to think about the inherent strengths New York has as a magnet for talent.
So in spite of it, we'll say.
Well, I'm not going to give up on New York. I spent 15 years of my life working for the city and also in the private sector.
It'd be nice if you didn't try to have incredible headwinds for a city.
He has a great opportunity to build a great team around him. Most New Yorkers, whether you voted for him or not, that live here like I do, raising a family here, are cheering for him because they want him to be successful and they want the city to be successful. We may not necessarily support his tax policies, and I do believe there is healing that needs to happen in unity that he needs to help catalyze, given the comments he's made in the past. He has the opportunity, now that the campaign is over, to govern. And a lot of times we do see people who govern, you govern differently than they campaign. He may or may not. Time will tell. I'm an optimist. I believe in the city, and I hope he has great people around him. I hope Jesse Tisch, who's an excellent police commissioner, takes his offer to stay. That would be a great statement.
But we're not even starting from a great place. That's where you started. 900,000 people left. The crime's up 25%. The occupancy rates are still bad. So we're starting from here and instituting, by all accounts, if he did what he wanted to do, these are wrong-minded policies, almost across the board. Would you acknowledge that?
I don't agree. I agree with the problems he's identified, that they need solutions like affordability. We financed $2.5 billion in affordable housing in New York City. I don't agree with all of his solutions. But he has touched on a theme that's been rising in New York City politics over the last 20 years.
Identifying a problem and addressing it with all the wrong solutions. Andrew, sorry, go ahead.
And I'm curious if we have a prediction market here around Jesse Tisch. I think to the extent that the business community is going to be supportive of him, it's largely around the view of Jesse Tisch being in that role to run the police department, and where she's been improving the safety situation in New York over the past several years, despite some of the numbers that you just reflected. If there was a poly market for a year from now, if you think Jesse Tisch is in that role, do you genuinely believe that this mayor not only wants her in that role, but wants to support her in that role, such that she will ultimately feel comfortable that the decisions that are being made are not around either reallocating resources or defunding the police in ways that he's described in prior moments?
Well, I think very highly of Commissioner Tisch. She's a Bloomberg alum. She's done a phenomenal job. She has integrity, intelligence, and passion. She has a decision to make. They have to have, I don't know what conversations they've had, but clearly they need to get on the same page. I've seen in city government when that police commissioner mayor relationship fractures. We saw it with Rudy Giuliani and Bill Bratton, and I've seen it work great, like we saw with Michael Bloomberg and Ray Kelly. who drove crime down, protect the city from terrorist attacks in the years after 9/11. So it's a really critical relationship. They absolutely need to be on the same page. And if they can't get there, then hopefully we'll find somebody else that's competent and qualified.
Celebrity cruises. Nothing comes close.
Recline with the highest quality standards from the footrest.
Let's get everybody up to speed. It was a remarkable evening, fascinating to see what took place. Democrats notching some key wins on election day. Democratic Socialist Zohran Mamdani is elected mayor of New York. He defeated independent Andrew Cuomo. About 90% of the expected votes in. Mamdani has more than 50% to Cuomo's roughly 42%. And even if you were to factor in the Sliwa vote, it looks like Zohran Mamdani would have still won. Democratic Representative Mike Sherrill elected New Jersey's next governor, beating Republican Jack Ciarelli. In Virginia, you had former Democratic Representative Abigail Spanberger set to become the state's first female governor, defeating the state's Republican lieutenant governor. In a post on Truth Social, President Trump said that Republicans lost yesterday because he wasn't on the ballot and because of the ongoing government shutdown. I don't know what your reaction to all of this is. I'm fascinated by just how big the win was for Zohran Mamdani. I thought it would be closer. I'm fascinated by some of the poly market results in terms of how frankly close these elections were, but how the poly market wasn't close. I don't know what that says about anything. And I also now wonder what this means for the Democratic Party and whether this is going to be considered. We didn't talk about California, by the way, as well, in terms of what happened there.
California pretty strongly, too, by 60% on the ballot. Look, this was a pass-fail test, though. They passed because these were all Democratic strongholds where these things happened. This was the anticipated result, so there weren't any upsets. Democrats passed the pass-fail test in this situation. I do wonder what it means for next year with the midterms and which route the Democratic Party is going to take in terms of whether they're going to follow the far left progressive wing or try and follow a more moderate centrist attack when it comes to how they handle national.
Midterms are always bad.
Yeah.
Just is it going to be worse than normal or not? I thought poly market was incredibly good. I mean, it was 90-10. It never got anywhere except 90-10 from him. There never was any question that he was going to win. And it never got more than 90-10. Maybe it was 84-15 in New Jersey for a little while, but there was never any waffling. I mean, I didn't wait up for any of this. And, my son was like, what he was worried about was down in Virginia and that guy with the tweets about killing, someone's family, and he won too. I think it's a little weird, Andrew, because, I saw some takes on CNN and David Axelrod, and so they were giddy and gloating, and it's just weird that, they know better than to think that this is a great outcome in New York City and for the Democratic Party to move that far left. But anything that repudiates Trump, it's like an enemy of my enemy. It's like they'll ride whatever horse they can that repudiates Trump, including a Democratic socialist. And if you sleep with the
Joe, look, I'm not disputing that. My view, I don't like the extreme sides of either party. I'd much prefer something in the middle. But the truth is, I think there's a lot of people. It's actually kind of like the question that Norah O'Donnell asked the president, which is to say that, she said to him about Zohran Mamdani, is he the left version of you? There were a lot of people in the Republican Party that did not want President Trump ultimately to win either, but ultimately fell in line in the same way and have continued to support him. And so we have this sort of unique moment in our country where I think there's people on both sides who think both sides are, to some extent, extreme. I know you don't think that that's the case.
I think of it in a different way. I don't. The litmus test for me is communism and socialism and big government and free things, and
Populist, and populism has run rampant for.
well, there's a populist. We're going to have the one of the founders of Aristo-populism is going to be on later today. Chris Busberg, who's with Hamid Malik in 1789, and we'll talk all about that. I mean, it's weird to let them eat cake, Aristo-populism, Warren Cass, people like that, to where billionaires can try, to help people that need help. But I always come back to, I've seen progressives try to help the people that they want to help. The policies never work. They never work. They never, ever work. And the people they're trying to help end up worse off. So it's how you approach things. Andrew, small government, maximum freedom, low taxation, private sector builds wealth and builds prosperity. And so I don't see how Trump and Mamdani, you can say them in the same sentence, but that's it doesn't, the comparisons don't hold, except that Democrats think Trump, or the left thinks Trump is extreme. Yeah, he's extreme, and there's tariffs and there's things like that, but at least he's, deep down, believes in capitalism and believes in the private sector, hopefully. He believes in the private sector so much that the government's investing in the private sector.
Questions about how Wall Street's going to react to this, how business in general.
We had 12 years of,
we had more than 50% increase in business tax.
We had a disaster we had, the blah, blah, blah for 8 years, and then Eric Adams for 4, the city's fine. So,
I wonder how divided the city's going to become as a result of all this. And that's what I'm concerned about. Both the divide that I think is going to exist in the city. Frankly, I think the divide that's going to get even wider just in the country writ large. And for the city, I live in New York City. I worry about, we keep talking about whether billionaires are going to leave the city. I worry more about whether businesses are going to leave the city if, in fact, the mayor is able to, increase corporate taxes. Forget about wealth taxes. Corporate taxes unto itself, given how high those are ultimately going to go, could create a real issue in the city. And I'm not even sure he has to be able to enact them unto itself, meaning even if he's unable to do it, even just talking about it as an idea, as something that he's trying to pursue, I think will scare off companies that were ever considering moving to New York, and will scare off companies that are maybe in New York considering whether to move or whether to move more employees to other places. And that, I think, is actually going to be a real issue.
Well, I think Chuck Schumer's great fear and trepidation about a primary from the left from AOC, that's going to happen. And the whole, government shutdown, everything else that Republicans say, that's why he needed to do that. I think it's going to be a Senator AOC. So
I do wonder if this
will get ready for that too.
Much worse. The government shutdown, because the Democrats will look at last night's results and say, hey, we don't need to fold or cave anytime soon.
That it's going to be this week.
Hopefully it happens this week.
But I don't think
there were about 12 senators who were.
Yeah, I don't think this had anything to do with the shutdown. Look, what is the base level of people that just think Donald Trump is the worst president ever? That's 30%. Then I've said this before. Then you add in, people that like free stuff and want health care that doesn't cost a lot, but like the government to pay for it. You got another 20 there, so you're at the majority already at 50%. And none of this is surprising.
There's some crossover.
Here's something Here's the way I was thinking about this morning, guys.
This is your problem, Andrew. After President Trump won, it's your problem. I'm glad I go. I got my own problems out there with Mikey Share.
After President Trump won, I think we all said, we're Americans. Let's give him a chance to do it.
Is that what you said? I don't remember yet.
No, that's
the first time too, right?
I said
the first time too. Did you? Yeah, all the Democrats did. And the first time too. And they were conjuring up great success. I did. They were conjuring up the whole approach. They were saying, give him a chance. Yeah. And as Democrats were saying, hey, let's give this guy a chance.
New Yorker. Joe, as a New Yorker, I woke up this morning and I said to myself, you know what? I don't agree with everything this mayor or
you want him on the show.
Well, now he's going to be our mayor. Says or plans to do, but I want to give him a chance, and I hope, for the sake of the city, he's able to.
You wouldn't even say you weren't voting. You wouldn't even say you weren't voting for him.
Excuse me.
You wouldn't even acknowledge that you weren't going to vote for him. So so you got that. You can tell him, hey, I didn't even say I wouldn't vote for you. So he'll come on the show. We can talk to him. He can tell us how everything's going to be free and it's going to be great.
The truth is that as a journalist, I think it's not my role, and not even my role. I actually think I cannot tell you who I'm voting for. You may disagree. You have a different position on that, but I think it's better not to. Not only better not to, I think it might even be a policy.
Okay. I mean, you can't give money, but I think you can make it clear on things that you disagree with, or else I don't even know what you are. If you can't, if you don't have the, that's your thing. Good. Stick with it.
Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. You know what? It's amazing when you're watching the reaction. You can see the divide. People are pro-capitalist. They believe in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and low government. You have another group of people that want more government intrusion. They think that a top-down control system is a better system. Now, the reality is that history shows that less government is better government up to a point. You have to have some regulation. You have to have some taxation. You have to have some, rules of a system. But if you have a government that is not intrusive, and you have a society that's aligned with God, country, and family, the society is more prosperous. But when you have a society that is nanny state and doesn't have an affinity to God, country, and family, then don't be surprised if the society starts to falter. With that said, please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the zeolite. Zeolite will bind to heavy metals, toxins, and chemicals and get rid of those out of your body within 6 to 8 hours through urination. Take it every day. Take 3 small drops underneath your tongue and drink filtered water. And this will bind to those toxins and chemicals and detoxify your liver and your kidney and your spleen and your vascular system. And by doing this on a regular basis, you're going to improve your immune system, improve your endocrine system, even your brain function. Because you do build up toxins in your brain. So please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the zeolite, detoxify your body regularly, and boost up that immune system. Super important. And another great stack for brain function is Clarity Factor. This will get rid of that brain fog and allow you to concentrate. And by being able to concentrate, you'll be more productive in school or at work or even at home. And Clarity Factor will help over time to build those positive neural networks so you can think faster and have better memory. Please go to my store, take this every day, drink it with filtered water. In addition, learn new things. Make sure you get enough sleep and have some sort of meditation or some sort of spirituality. And by doing that, you're bringing down your central nervous system into a parasympathetic mode instead of sympathetic mode. If you're sympathetic, if you have sympathetic activation of the nervous system, you're more stressed. It's like a fight or flight response, but rest and digest is parasympathetic. And when you are in a more parasympathetic mode, your brain function is actually better over time because it's less stressed. It doesn't have as high levels of cortisol, and elevated cortisol levels chronically could cause damage to tissues. So you want to bring your system down to a parasympathetic. So spirituality or mindfulness, doing some cardio, getting better blood flow to the brain, taking Clarity Factor, learning new things, talking to people, having a more positive mindset, even if New York is going communist, will help to slow down the aging process. It's a holistic approach. Please go to my store, get the Clarity Factor, take it every day and drink it with filtered water to get rid of that brain fog and to improve that neuroplasticity.
Joining us right now is Roger Altman. He, of course, is the founder and senior chairman of Evercore, a good friend of the show. And Roger, it's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Becky.
Joining us. You are somebody we kind of always look to as a moderating voice. So why don't you talk us through your take on the Mamdani election? Because you look at the New York Post, you look at other places, they say this is basically the end. You've got a slightly more restrained view on it. Not that you voted for him.
There are three, I think there are three main points here. One is, it's an amazing political win. So this guy has a lot of political talent, and you have to take your hat off to him. Number two, we just, in the city, endured 12 years of de Blasio and Adams, who, in my view, were both incompetent. And yet the city prospered in many respects.
So in other words, it's okay for the ham sandwich running the place?
And so I think it's hard to imagine that he's going to be worse than they were. Hard to imagine. In addition, the mayoralty has its limits. No taxing authority. Port Authority runs the airports and the ports. MTA is a separate entity. It's a fairly limited job. Now, the other way to look at it is, of course, what a crapshoot. He's 34 years old. He's never had a serious job. He's never managed people. He's never managed any organization. And it's probably going to be pretty chaotic in the early going. But the city is a resilient place and an amazing place. And if it survived 12 years of de Blasio and Adams, it will survive Mamdani.
Will businesses be able to function the same way? Will businesses be able to embrace and get by?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, anybody who met with Bill de Blasio and who was in the business sector or Wall Street, he wasn't exactly a warm and cuddly presence. And I had that experience. And so, yes, it will function.
Kathy Wild was here.
I just heard her, yeah.
Yeah, and look, in some ways, she, because of her job, has to be on board with whoever's coming in here. She was there at the speech last night that Mamdani gave. I take it you were not?
No, I wasn't.
What has to happen next?
Well, as Kathy said, an early sign will be who he surrounds himself with. If you look back at the night Eric Adams was elected, and you look at who was standing around him on the stage, in retrospect, it was a very bad sign. Now, I don't know what the result of the...
A lot of those people got chased out from
legal reasons.
Yeah, for legal reasons.
Yeah, I don't know what decisions Mamdani will make and whether the dynamic between Jesse Tisch, for example, and Mamdani will be an acceptable one or not. But an early sign will be who he chooses. And initially, he's been surrounded by a lot of former de Blasio people, at least as I've seen it. I hope that's not the whole deal.
Well, we're broadening out a little. Who's the leader of the Democratic Party? I'll tell you where I'm going with this. I heard that Spanberger and Mikey Sherrill were the new model for where Democrats are going to go, and they called them moderate. I'm not really sure that that's true.
Relative to Mamdani?
Relative to him, they're moderate, but and Chuck Schumer with a possible challenge from the left by AOC, it's obvious that he's doing all kinds of things to try to deal with that. You were in a couple of Republican administrations, the Clinton administration and the Carter, Carter maybe wasn't, but Uber. Yeah, exactly. That's a good one. See, Roger knows the game. That's the thing. I know I always like it. But are you at all uncomfortable with where the geographic center of the Democratic Party is right now?
So let's talk about this. So these wins last night, Virginia, New Jersey, California referendum, Mamdani, and some of the lower races, Virginia House of Delegates and so forth.
The AG in Virginia.
A shot in the arm for Democrats because Democrats have been very demoralized. You see that in fundraising, you see that elsewhere. This will fire them up. But these are not surprising wins. These are blue locations. Right? The one would have been surprising is if they'd lost. Now, the margins were impressive. They're not surprising wins. Now, two more points. I think it does set the Democrats up, or generally they're set up pretty well for November 26th, and here's why. Typically, the first off-year election after a new president is a referendum on the administration. It's not really about the other party. And that's to their advantage. Secondly, Trump's approval ratings are not very good. and he's 37% approval on the economy. On the other hand, the economy is the number one issue. If he has to get that up, it's going to be tough. Now, we don't know what the final result of the gerrymanders will be, and we don't know whether Trump will try to suppress the vote in various ways. But you'd have to say the Democrats at the moment look good for November 26th. But to get to your question, last night doesn't resolve the internal conflicts besetting the Democratic Party. Doesn't resolve it at all.
How far left do you go?
Well, there's an interesting new report, which I commend to you, just published the last few days, called Deciding to Win. I had nothing to do with it, but it's really smart. And there's some remarkable polling data in it, the best I've seen, which shows, number one, in recent years, the Democratic Party nationally did move to the left in a notable way. And number two, it really hurt them. And it's unmistakable data. I mean, it's just compelling. So, and of course, it argues for a move towards the center, which they call moderate. This will all play out, not really in November 26th, although to some extent, but in the presidential election of 28. But my point is, the results last night, while heartening, don't resolve this conflict. They just don't. And the Democratic brand is down and out, and the party's in tough shape, even though it seems well set up for November 26th.
Right. I've thought that if the same way that the criticism of certain mainstream Republicans is they don't push back on President Trump, where I guess moderate or set, right in the center, people think that he should be pushed back. I see the same thing in the Democratic Party. I see poor John Fetterman just saying really normal things, and he's alone on an island. I mean, the Warners, there's so many supposedly reasonable Democrats. It's just crickets about really important things, and with the House, when they vote on things, there's not even a single dissenter most of the time. In 14 votes, not a single person sways from the Democratic dogma.
Well, the Democrats are still.
They're good at that.
Well, they're still
I think the
better.
Republicans are jealous.
Yeah, I think they are too. They're better at controlling their party.
By the way, what evidence of the challenges the party has is the shutdown.
Yeah.
I happen to think the shutdown is a national disgrace. You look at those photos of lines in food bank.
Well, we're going to disagree on this because you think it's actually blame on both sides.
No,
I do. I think
nobody is doing a great job.
No, that's what I mean. But a continuing CR, we've done this a million times, Roger. You know that, and it's a supermajority you need, so Republicans can't do it. It's fully extortion, and maybe we need the Medicaid thing. Maybe we need the government to pay for all health care. I can see how people would say that, but this isn't how you do it. You open the government and then decide how to do this.
Well,
don't extort.
I'm going to agree with you in one respect. We got to end the shutdown.
Yeah.
There's an idea floating around. I'm sure there are many. I just happen to notice this one, where they would end the shutdown in exchange for an assured vote by an assured date on the enhanced incentives for Obamacare.
Yes.
Well, just do that. Just do that.
For how long? A year?
What do you mean?
How long is it enhanced? Yeah.
I don't know what the answer to that would be. I don't know.
To give them a vote.
Because that's only $35 billion.
Right.
But what was the $1.5 trillion? They wanted, Schumer wanted PBS funded, and then $1.5 trillion is not $40 billion. It's $1.5 trillion.
But right now the issue is just the enhanced subsidy for Obamacare.
They should have said that maybe from the start.
And they need to resolve this. I mean, I think when you look at those lines at those food banks, I mean, that is terrible.
I don't know about the food lines in New York. I haven't seen them. I didn't really look though. But the thing is that if those food lines for SNAP or whatever, those pantries, the food pantries, if it's going to illegal aliens, I'm against it. I'm totally against it. They should not be, illegal aliens should not be getting subsidies from Americans at all. Our tax-paying dollars should not go to them, and nor should philanthropic dollars go to them, because those dollars could have gone to people in need that are American citizens. So that's simple.
With us now, an all New Jersey panel, Democratic strategist Julie Rosinsky and Republican strategist Mike Duhane. In an off-year election like this, there are dangers of over-interpreting the results and also under-interpreting. So instead of making you choose, I think I'm going to give you a chance to do both, right? So over-interpret what we saw in New Jersey and Virginia, because actually I think it's pretty much the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, look, the overinterpretation of this is that this is a permanent majority that Democrats will be able to keep. And what you saw, at least in New Jersey, I have to look at the numbers of Virginia, is there are cohorts of voters who came out very strongly for Mickey Sherrill, who are not necessarily Democratic voters anymore, specifically the Latino community, which Democrats have been for many, many years to take for granted. You cannot take that.
I'm just, what the big problem is what's happening in New York. All right, let's see here. All right, let's listen into the payrolls. They rose to 42,000 in October. This is through the ADP number. This is MSNBC.
Finance the old way. Finance the ramp way.
We are getting some numbers that are pretty important right now. We're going to be looking at the ADP private payroll data. It's just out. Steve Leisman joins us with those numbers.
Numbers, what a thought. Fantastic. ADP is saying that private payrolls grew by 42,000 in the month of October, with a decent split when it comes to by sector. Goods producing up 9,000, service providing up 33,000. This is a question, is this the new normal we have to get used to? Is a relatively lackluster number that because we don't have the labor force growth, is this a good number relative to the labor force growth? We don't know because we're all the unemployment size. But I don't, the household survey, what I don't like is how we got here. And this is something that's a bit of concern here. Small businesses, less than 50 workers, losing 10,000. That is the third month in a row that they have lost workers here. Medium size down 21,000 and large over 500. That's where the job gains are. I have a concern anecdotally that this is a potential tariff effect.
The reason why there's a big concern is that most businesses in the United States are medium to small. So if jobs are hemorrhaging in the medium to small, but in large businesses, they're increasing by 73K, but offsetted by 31K in losses, that's not a really healthy economy. Because what happens when large companies start having revenue problems? Boom, they start laying off workers right away. So this is setting up for a major employment shock.
Where small business is being hurt, also perhaps at the consumer level, what's going on. Looking at by industry here, 47,000 for trade, transport, and utilities. That's interesting to me because I would think that would be a place that would be hurt when it comes to some of what's going on with the tariff. Education, hospitality, and health services, that's the place we often get the job growth. Leisure hospitality, though, down 6,000. Information down 17,000. And just one more thing here, we have, I believe, the change in wage growth. And that's unchanged. And that's, what is that saying to you? Unchanged in 4.5% for job stayers, 6.7 for job changers. Those are kind of like in a status quo or maybe a quiet period here in the job market. It's not going down, which would tell you there was a lot of slack in the job market, but it's also not going up, telling you it's tight. We may just be, maybe Goldilocks? Is that fair to say?
It's running hotter than
it's running better. People are making
another news, more breaking news. ISM services are up.
Becky, and I also think that it's not declining, which would tell you there's a lot of slack in the labor market. I will say one more point, which is that this was about 20,000 more than expected. And it's also a nice turnaround from the prior month. But why listen to me when we have the unofficial commissioner of the Bureau of ADP Labor Statistics right here?
I think she's actually the official.
The official, right,
right. Okay. Neela Richardson is here. She is ADP's chief economist. And Neela, we are starved for information right now, so we're probably going to parse this 20 ways to Sunday. What is the big takeaways that you see from this data?
I think the first thing to note is the tepid recovery. We saw a loss in September. We actually put out a weekly pulse number last week showing and signaling a direction of tepid recovery. Now, as Steve mentioned, this is not the hiring rates that we saw at the beginning of the year. Far from it. But it is a recovery. It is not broad-based. We did see some gains in education and healthcare. We did note the gains in trade, transportation, and utilities. But there's some weakness. You see it in professional services, you see it in information services. And so, and when you think about the consumer, you see it in leisure and hospitality. And then the final point, again, Steve mentioned it, I'll put a little bit more data into it, is that 3 in every 4 workers in the United States work in a company with less than 250 employees. And so while big companies make headlines, small companies drive hiring. And so to see that weakness at the small company level is still a concern. And I think that's one of the reasons why the recovery has been so tepid.
What did you think of Steve's contention that this could be because of tariffs hurting small businesses more than mid or large businesses?
I think it's the cacophony of everything all at once. It could be tariffs and tariff uncertainty. It could be hiring. We think that small firms don't hire using H-1B visas sometimes. No, small firms are dynamic too. They're hiring talent around the world. And so that uncertainty could be a pressure point for small firms. But let's not forget the consumer. There's been so much talk about the K-shaped recovery. Well, that lower leg of that K did have some discretionary income for leisure and hospitality that might be slowing. So there is a lot of things that could be affecting small businesses right now. The good news in terms of the overall macro story is it hasn't slowed down large company hirings to the same extent.
I'm going to make 2 really quick points. One is if you were paying attention to CNBC a week ago Tuesday, you would have had the weekly ADP report, and that would have given you a heads up that things had kind of turned around from the prior monthly report. And we'll be back again on Tuesday with that weekly ADP number. So people want to follow that. The other thing that I think is interesting here is we don't know, but 42,000 could be just the right number. Again, I don't like how we got here. We don't know if you bring immigration down to 0 and labor force growth is 0, 42,000 could be enough to bring down the unemployment rate.
And to add to that point, Neela, yesterday we spoke with John Gibson, the Paycheck CEO, who looks at small businesses and said, look, the biggest limiting factor for small businesses right now is that they can't find people to hire.
It's a challenge, and it's not a challenge in every industry. There's going to be some industries that are very, that you'll see the labor shortness and the tightness in the labor market. There's some industries where you won't. And to add to the immigration, because that's just one component of demographics, we are an aging population. That gets lost on people. Just by demographics alone, we're going to grow employment at a fraction over the next decade compared to the previous decade. So you add all this stuff up, there's some real challenges and supply shortages. So that underlying number, that's a big commentary among economists. What's the break even now that doesn't push up the unemployment rate? I think that's the wrong question. I think you have to go deeper and more granular into the data to see who is unemployed and what sectors are really seeing the tightness and what sectors are seeing the slack. So this is a time of granularity. That's why I love the ADP data. It's not a time of macro conclusions because there's so many things happening underneath the surface.
Becky, let me make one more point here. I was hoping for a number of plus 70 or minus 70.
Why?
Because the Fed is on the fence about just how weak the job market is. And they're looking for some guidance from the alternative data to say which way should we go with rates. If this were minus 70, I mean, nobody wants anybody to lose jobs, but from a Fed clarity point of view.
I'll take plus 42 in a befuddled Fed.
Okay.
And I think that's what we get. We get the muddled middle because there's no easy
It's the model, what did you call that?
The muddled middle.
Muddled middle. That's where we're at right now. And that's from a Federal Reserve point of view. I think they want definitive data showing the job market is weakening and therefore we should cut, or the job market's fine. I could just say tune in Tuesday because we'll have more job data from ADP and other job data on Friday too. We'll have the job descriptions.
Are you struggling in discrete math?
All right, so we have a S&P 500 trading at 6,798. The resistance level right now is at 6,800. But I think we'll surpass that. Maybe not today, but we're definitely with the news about the ADP and the ISM news that came out. It's positive for equities. VIX is trading now at 18. Oil's trading at $60.26 a barrel. And the euro is trading at 114. Natural gas is trading at 4.338. And I think oil is trading at 33 right now. Yeah, 33.04. So let's listen into Bloomberg here. But before we do, please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the omega-3. This will help with your heart health. There's lots of individuals that have problems with their cardiovascular system, and it's important to try to improve your cardiovascular health. You can do that by taking the omega-3. This will help to bring down LDL levels, increase your HDL levels. When you do that, you're reducing plaque formation. In addition, omega-3 brings down inflammation. That also helps to reduce plaque formation. Omega-3 has the ability to prevent your red blood cells from over clotting, which is super important. So to improve your cardiovascular health, please go to my store and get the omega-3. Myotrol helps with gene expression to build muscle. As you get older, your genes start to methylate and they don't express as well as they used to. It's called aging. Well, by taking Myotrol, you can actually help with the gene expression to build muscle and to maintain muscle. This is really important to take if you're 40 years of age or older, male or female, or if you're an athlete, younger or older. Take Myotrol. This will also help the health of your mitochondria, so your muscles have the ATP to maintain that energy and to build that muscle. So please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the Myotrol. Make sure you do some resistance training. And Goodnight Formula. Goodnight Formula has tryptophan, melatonin, GABA, and passion flower. Goodnight Formula will help you to get into 3 to 5 cycles of deep sleep and REM sleep so you consolidate memory, detoxify your central nervous system, and be well rested. And by doing this regularly, you're slowing down the aging process. Please take the Goodnight Formula each night, drink it with filtered water. So a great stack here. Help with your cardiovascular health by taking the omega-3. Help with your musculature by taking Myotrol. And help with your sleep and brain health by taking Goodnight Formula. Please go to my store, use discount 5, you get $5 off any order, and slow down the aging process. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. The link is in the description of this video and all my videos. All right, let's listen into Bloomberg. They're talking about it looks like the tariffs and the court test. Supreme Court looks like they're going and looking into it.
For tariffs under IEPA, because the Supreme Court is as high as you can go, as you want. So, but there are other ways that he can implement tariffs, and he has implemented tariffs in other ways. And apparently the administration is looking for other things. So it's not the end. The question is whether they'll have to reimburse businesses for some of the tariff that they've paid. And that will not be fast or easy. That's going to be a process. It would be a process. I mean, it's been done before in smaller amounts, but that'll be another question. That's sort of hanging over the Supreme Court's head because Donald Trump has been saying that it's the life and death of the country. I mean, he's been saying some extraordinary things about the importance of this case, and that's going to be weighing on the justice's mind somewhere in the back, I think.
Yeah, Paul, according to Bloomberg Economics, the U.S. is collecting $556 million daily in IEPA tariffs.
Okay.
And by the end of 2025, it'll top $140 billion. Can you imagine trying to refund that?
Yes.
And another thing is, remember when Joe Biden was president and he tried to do something like, give pay off student loans or the eviction moratorium, and the Supreme Court didn't let him do any of that because they said that was a major question. And major economic questions, it has to be Congress that gives explicit authority to the president. So we'll see how they treat Donald Trump compared to how they treated.
I'm paying attention to this stuff. I'm telling you. I mean, it's not just June. I'm paying attention.
Will
to
you
this
listen
stuff.
with me later on to your own
Absolutely.
thing?
This is good stuff. June Grosso, she's a legal analyst and host of Bloomberg Law for Bloomberg News, joining us live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. Market Drivers is brought to you by Interactive Brokers. Trade over 10,000 U.S. stocks and ETFs, U.S. equity index options, U.S. treasuries, and more on your timetable. Learn more at IBKR.com/around the clock. Boy, yesterday was a busy day if you're like a political junkie. You got a lot of stuff to kind of pay attention to. New Jersey, Virginia, New York City, California.
Yeah.
Some stuff too.
And if you're a Democrat, then you're feeling pretty good this morning, given the sweep of the results.
I would think so. And, you know, in my state, New Jersey, Mikey Sherrill, she won by double digits. And
Yeah,
it was
pretty handily.
It has to be really, really tight going into it. So I don't know what to read about that, but we're going to check in with Miles Miller. He's Bloomberg's senior reporter, and he's been following this stuff really closely. Let's start with New York City, Miles. What do you think Mr. Mamdani does now that he's won when, boy, he's a neophyte. What does he do? How does he get going here?
Yeah, I think the first task for him is going to be to set up this transition team so he can figure out who he's going to bring with him to City Hall. He's got just about 52 days or so, 52 to 57 days or so, 2 months. And so he's got to figure out who he's bringing from his coalition, and then where will he find his policy people? Where will he find his communications people? And how does he build out that deputy mayor staff? First deputy mayor, does he keep the deputy mayor for public safety? Does he get rid of that position? All of that goes into what is in his planning. What we also know is what he said this morning, speaking to a reporter this morning, saying that the way that he feels that he'll be able to pay for freezes on the rent or free buses or universal child care is a tax on the wealthiest New Yorkers, number one, and then number two, raising the corporate tax rate. Right now at 7.25%, raising it to 11.5%. He says that'll give them about $9 billion to fund this. But he's got to do that with Albany, and the governor is going to be running for re-election in just 2 months' time. I don't know that she has the appetite to raise taxes when she's asking New Yorkers to vote for her against, say, Elise Stefanik.
Yeah, and that's where reality comes in. We know that the
I'm gonna try to listen into the oral arguments for the tariff here. This is what's happening in the Supreme Court right now.
All of these things to face to tax fossil fuel or to do something else. That's all Biden would have had to do with any of his programs.
Let me put it this way, if I may.
Is just declare some foreign-facing purpose.
If I may, look, maybe I can articulate it this way. The power to impose tariffs is a core application of the power to regulate foreign commerce, which is what the phrase regulate importation in IEPA naturally evokes.
Why is it, could you tell me why it is that when Congress intended to permit a president to regulate by imposing tariffs, it's always used tariff and regulate? I have about 16 laws in the past that when Congress intended regulate to mean taxing, that it used taxes simultaneously. But it didn't here.
Respectfully, this court came to the opposite conclusion, if I may, in Algonquin, where the phrase was not in
well, but that was, we did something in Algonquin. It was in the duties section. So unlike here, it was paired with questions about decreasing tariffs and increasing tariffs. So it's a very different statute than the one at issue here.
But the governing language, admittedly, the references to duties in Section 232A, 232C does not refer to them, and the court didn't refer to 232A at all, and the phrase duties or tariffs analysis. What it held was the phrase adjust imports, which includes a verb that's narrower.
But it was in the context, it was in context of activities that had to do with raising and lowering duties. Here, the verbs that accompany regulate have nothing to do with raising revenues in the form of taxes.
And counsel, Algonquin wasn't a textualist opinion. You would agree with that? In other words, the analysis that the court was using there was really key to the legislative history of that statute, and it wasn't as though we were doing an interpretation of the word adjust.
I disagree with that. I think you read the opinion, first it talks about plain meaning, then it talks about statutory context, and then it goes on to legislative history, so it was all three of those. And the conclusion it came to, it directly addressed and rejected the argument that the D.C. Circuit had accepted in that case, which is that when Congress wants to delegate the authority to tariff, it uses a consistently explicit and well-defined approach, which is to use these magic words, tariff, tax, impost, and so forth.
All right,
Congress is not bound to use that particular formulation once it confers its power.
Let me ask you about the premise of your argument, which you sort of started at the beginning saying that one would expect for Congress to give the president a broad leeway in this kind of foreign affairs context. And I guess I'm wondering whether you also don't have to contend with the actual purpose of IEPA in making this argument, because as I understand it, that the IEPA was designed and intended to limit presidential authority, that Congress was concerned about how presidents had been using the authority under the predecessor's statute, TWIA, and it's pretty clear that Congress was trying to constrain the emergency powers of the president in IEPA. So it seems a little inconsistent to say that we have to interpret a statute that was designed to constrain presidential authority, consistent with an understanding that Congress wanted the president to have essentially unlimited authority.
I disagree with that, because what Congress actually did as...
What part do you disagree with? I'm sorry.
Well, I disagree with the notion that they were trying to constrain the breadth of the actions the president may take when it comes to this particularly narrow domain, which is various regulations of transactions.
But how can you disagree with that? I mean, the history is what it is.
Because they made a series of changes to IEPA that relate to the triggering conditions, so to speak, and the procedures that apply, but they did not change the language in IEPA.
Right, but what was the intent of Congress in changing the language? Wasn't it to constrain presidential authority in this area?
To constrain it in the triggering conditions and the procedures that apply.
So those are the triggering conditions and procedures that apply are a means to constrain. That is how they went around about constraining. But my point is that Congress enacted this legislation with the intent of preventing the president from having unlimited powers in this area. And you're asking us to now interpret that statute consistent with an understanding that Congress wanted to allow the president to do pretty much whatever he wanted in this area.
And therefore, the natural inference is Congress did not intend to change the scope of authority, the powers, the tools the president can exercise.
Did any president under TWIA use that language to impose tariffs?
Well, yes, President Nixon's 1971.
Not a tariff. That wasn't a tariff. It was a licensing agreement during wartime. It was a specific thing. A tariff I'm talking about.
I'm referring to President Nixon's 1971 tariff.
I'm sorry, excuse me. Yes, I thought you meant Lincoln.
Not only that, but then it was upheld by the Court of Appeals of exclusive jurisdiction under this very phrase.
Can I back you up just a second? I'm sorry. You're talking so quickly. President Nixon did not rely on TWIA initially to impose the tariffs. Is that correct? I understood that was just a litigating position that he took once it was challenged. That was not his initial.
I wouldn't put it that way, because he has a broad invocation. I'm invoking a whole range of statutes, something like that, in Proclamation 4074. And I think the understanding is he didn't want to kind of spook our allies by invoking the Trading with the Enemies Act by specifically invoking it, but in litigation it was defended on that ground. So the Department of Justice defended it as an exercise in TWIA and did so successfully.
What's the significance of the Nixon example and precedent here? Because I think figuring that out is real important to deciding this case correctly. So,
well, there's one obvious, very powerful takeaway from it, which is that this very two-word phrase, regulated importation, that we say it carries with it the authority to tariff, impose regulatory tariffs at the border, forward-facing tariffs at the border, and we say that's a core application of the phrase regulated importation, had been interpreted 2 years before Congress reenacted that language in IEPA, had been interpreted to carry with it the authority to impose tariffs. So this court said in Algonquin, for example, with respect to
Just back on the Nixon, what was the scope of the Nixon tariffs?
10%. He imposed a 10% tariff kind of across the board to all our major trading partners to address a balance of payments deficit, where he was trying to bring all the major industrial nations to the negotiating table, which he successfully did, but for the imposition of the tariffs, and they negotiated the Smithsonian Agreement in about 5 months, after which he lifted the tariff. So the tariff there was used as here, in part as leverage to get our trading partners to the negotiating table, and it was subsequently
That's what Trump's doing. Trump's doing the same thing as Nixon.
Federal Circuit's predecessor that had exclusive jurisdiction over that question to include the power to tariff. And then 2 years later, Congress took that same phrase and reenacted it in IEPA after carefully studying the problem of presidential emergency powers and being deeply concerned about, excessive or abusive exercise of that power. So that whole sort of process gives sort of strong sort of confirmation that this phrase regulated importation carries with it the power of tariff. Now, of course, that's not our leading argument. Our lead argument on interpretation is there's a pedigree, historical pedigree of regulating imports specifically, where the power to tariff is just the sort of a core application of that, a quintessential exercise of that power. That goes back to Gibbons against Ogden and Justice Story's treatise and runs all the way through cases like McGoldrick and Board of Trustees.
Sauer, can I just ask you a question? Can you point to any other place in the code or any other time in history where that phrase, together, regulate importation, has been used to confer tariff imposing authority?
Well, as to regulate importation, that was held in TWIA. So obviously, and that's...
Okay, so an intermediate appellate court held it in TWIA, but you just told Justice Kavanaugh that wasn't your lead argument, that your lead argument was this long history of the phrase regulate importation being understood to include tariff authority. So my question is, has there ever been another instance in which a statute has used that language to confer the power?
Well,
putting aside Yoshida.
I mean, obviously, other statutory examples of just imports, the cases we rely on are cases where, for example, in Gibbons, it's Ogden and Justice Story's.
But that just shows the word can be used that way. None of those cases talked about it as conferring tariff authority. I understood you to be citing McGoldrick and Gibbons in those cases just to show that it's possible to say that regulating commerce includes the power to tariff.
I think our argument goes a bit further than that as an interpretive matter, because if you look at that history, the history of delegating...
Could you just answer the Justice's question?
Can you identify any statute that used that phrase to confer tariff?
Yeah, the only two statutes I can identify now are TWIA, as interpreted in Yoshida, and then closely related, not regulated importation, but adjust imports in section 232.
Well, I think adjust imports is differently. So the answer is the contested application in TWIA, and then now in IEPA.
And then, of course, I mean, there's a sort of direct line there.
Yeah, I understand that, but okay.
But then more fundamentally, we rely on historical sources to sort of, there's this long historical pedigree of broad delegations of the foreign commerce power, not the power to tax that we're not asserting here, delegations of the foreign commerce power to the president, going back to Gibbons against Ogden, all the way through the Goldrick and Board of Trustees, where this court and founding era sources say the power to, in other words, the power to tariff is kind of this natural, as everyone knows, that includes...
Let's ask you one other question about the plain text, General Sauer. So you've referred to the other verbs in IEPA as capacious. Would you really describe them as capacious? Because to me, things like nullify and void have definite meanings. I agree with you that regulate is a broader term, but those words I think are powerful. They pack a punch, but I wouldn't describe them as capacious in the sense that they have a wide range of meanings. So can you describe what you mean by capacious?
Let me put it this way. Look at all 9 verbs together, and you're looking at a spectrum of powers from the most sort of negative, nullify, block, prohibit, void, to the most affirmative, direct, compel, and then also powers in between that are more intermediate, regulate, investigate, and so forth. So the natural common sense inference from that grammatical structure is the intention of Congress to sort of cover the waterfront.
Well, possible, except Congress did take out a whole bunch of verbs. It took out confiscate, vest, hold, use, administer, liquidate, sell, which were in the prior statute. And crucially, what it doesn't have here is anything that refers to raising revenue. So it has a lot of verbs, it has a lot of actions that can be taken under this statute. It just doesn't have the one you want.
Well, I would say the notion that all these other verbs are sort of not revenue raising, like block and prohibit, I think that argument is unconvincing for two reasons. One, of course, is that we're not saying it confers a revenue raising power, we're saying it confers a regulatory power, and that's a crucial distinction. But also.
Yes, but if I can just stop you there, regulatory power, I mean, yes, it says regulate, but I'll broaden out Justice Barrett's question. Is there any place that you can find in the entire code where regulate, used just as regulate, includes taxing power?
We don't assert that. We say it includes tariffing power when it's combined with importation, and that's just the most natural.
Right, because the natural understanding of regulate, even though in fact we can regulate through taxes, but when the code uses regulate, we don't typically understand it to refer to duties or taxes or tariffs or anything of the kind. And then if you look at the flip side of this, and you look at all the tariff statutes that Congress has passed, and I mean, they use language about revenue raising, tariffs and duties and taxes, all the language that does not appear in the statute you rely on.
Start with the sort of grammatical structure of the statute, then refer to the other statutes. Regulate importation. You put those two words in combination. That's the inference of that is, the founders discussed with this sort of like, as everyone knows, attitude. Regulate importation, one of the most natural applications of that is the power to tariff. So when Congress confers the power to regulate imports, it is naturally conferring the power to tariff, which it has delegated to the executive branch, again and again and again.
I'm sorry, so it doesn't say regulate tariffs, it says regulate importations and exportations. You agree that they can't put taxes on exportations?
I agree with that, yes.
All right, so why should we think that it's natural then to think that regulate importation includes taxing importations?
Because that is how.
In the conjunctive, importations and exportations, if they can't do it with respect to exportations, why are we permitting them to do it with respect to importations?
Because as this court has recognized, going back to Gibbons against Ogden and going through McGoldrick and Board of Trustees, the phrase, when you're regulating imports, tariffing is a core application of that. So in other words, if you're saying go regulate trading and securities,
so why is it that Congress has always used regulate and tax together in the code? Are you telling us that with respect to its use of regulate in other statutes, the taxing reference is superfluous? They didn't need to do that?
I'm not sure what other statutes use regulate and tax together, but this statute has a specific historical pedigree going back to its enactment during World War I in 1917, where the phrase regulate importation is evoking an inherent power to tariff that became established in the 19th century in cases like Hamilton against Dillon and so forth. That history is, I think, set forth in Professor Bonsai's amicus brief.
Counsel, some time ago you dismissed the applicability of the major questions doctrine, and I want you to explain that a little bit more. I mean, it seems that it might be directly applicable. You have a claim source in IEPA that had never before been used to justify tariffs. No one has argued that it does until this particular case. Congress uses tariffs in other provisions, but not here. And yet, and correct me on this if I'm not right about it, the justification is being used for a power to impose tariffs on any product from any country in any amount for any length of time. That seems like, I'm not suggesting it's not there, but it does seem like that's major authority, and the basis for the claim seems to be a misfit. So why doesn't it apply again?
Well, we agree that it's a major power, but it's in the context of a statute that is explicitly conferring major powers. That the point of the statute is to confer major powers to address major questions, which are emergencies. So it'd be unusual to say, look at the statute and say, we're not going to find a major power.
Well, but the exercise of the power is to impose tariffs, right? And the statute doesn't use the word tariffs.
But it uses the word regulate importation. And historically, a core core central application of that, a big piece of that has always been to tariff. If you had asked the founders, how do you regulate imports? They said, of course, we tariff. That's what we do. So if you're unusual saying we're giving you power to regulate importation, and say, but you cannot impose regulatory tariffs, that'd be almost a contradiction. All the historical sources we cite are relate to that particular historical pedigree. And as I was referring to earlier, there's a specific pedigree of regulated importation here in the specific context of the presidents Polk and Lincoln and President McKinley asserting the authority to impose tariff.
It's amazing that we actually, through our tax-paying dollars, pay for this crap. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and help your pancreatic health by getting the digestive enzyme complex. This will help to break up carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. Allow you to absorb your nutrients with less stress on your pancreas. Really important. If you're 40 years or older, your pancreas doesn't perform as well, even if you're healthy. Please go to my store and get the digestive enzyme complex to help your pancreatic health and be able to absorb your proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids and produce less stress on your digestive system. Get the ubiquinol. Ubiquinol is the most bioavailable form of CoQ10 that you can purchase. Ubiquinol will soak up free radicals because it's an antioxidant, but it'll also help to improve the health of your mitochondria so you have more energy, more ATP. And ubiquinol will help to protect your neurons. And that's really important to maintain neural health. And olive leaf extract, it'll help to bring down inflammation and help with your lipid profile. By bringing down inflammation, you're reducing plaque formation and boosting up your immune system. And by bringing down LDL levels and increasing your HDL levels, you're reducing plaque formation. Super important to take, dual purpose, helps your immune system and your cardiovascular system. So a great stack would be getting the digestive enzyme complex to help with your pancreatic health and be able to absorb your nutrients. Olive leaf extract to boost up that immune system and help with your cardiovascular system. And ubiquinol to boost up your energy levels and help with your neural health. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Back to the Supreme Court.
The importer could be an American, could be a foreign company. A lot of times it's a wholly owned American subsidiary of a foreign corporation. So it gets allocated. And the empirical estimates range from like 30% to 80% of like how much is borne by Americans.
It's been suggested that the tariffs are responsible for significant reduction in our deficit. I would say that's raising revenue domestically.
There certainly is an incidental and collateral effect of the tariffs. They do raise revenue, but it's very important that they are regulatory tariffs, not revenue-raising tariffs. And the way you can see this, I think, if you look at this policy is by far the most effective if nobody ever pays the tariffs. I say two policies, right? So if you look at the trade deficit emergency, if nobody ever pays the tariffs, instead Americans direct their consumption towards American producers and stimulate the rebuilding of our hollowed out manufacturing base, then the policy is by far the most effective. So a tariff is regulatory tariff.
Why not do what the statute permits? Bar importation of products altogether. That would be the most effective way to do it.
What the question
you follow the statute. The statute says the president can do that. What it doesn't say is the president can raise revenue.
What it says is he can regulate importation and go back hundreds of years the way you
quotas, pausing it, subjecting some countries and not others to importation bans. There's a lot of verbs, but none of them include generating revenue as a side effect or directly.
Let me address that verb point, if I may, because think about the canonical example. A statute that refers to a list of swords, knives, daggers, dirks, and pikes. There you look at that list of things and you say, aha, those are all weapons, therefore a pike is a spear, not a fish in that particular context. Now look at this list of verbs: block, prohibit, compel, direct, and so forth. You don't look at that naturally as an ordinary reader and say, oh look, they're all not revenue raising. What you say is they're all very broad, powerful, actions of these.
But the verbs that are in the statute are actually doing something. I mean, they're in the statute for a reason, and as I understand it, Congress actually explained to us in its Senate report and House report when it enacted the 1941 amendments to TWIA what it was doing. It said that what we are doing is authorizing the president, the Senate report, quote, to control or freeze property transactions where a foreign interest is involved. There's similar language about controlling, freezing control in the House report. So I appreciate that generally you can look at these words and you can imagine that they mean certain things, but here we have evidence that Congress was actually trying to do a particular thing with respect to the authority that it was presenting to the president, and that thing was not raising revenue.
I think that the powers that Congress was conferring on the president are best understood through the plain text of the statutes, which includes regulating.
No, I know, but some of us care about the legislative history. And so the plain text of the statute has certain verbs in it. It also has regulate commerce, as you say. And when I look at the legislative history, it appears as though Congress was trying to give the president the authority to, quote, control or freeze property transactions where a foreign interest is involved. And in the TWIA context, that makes perfect sense because we're talking about a wartime dynamic. And what is happening is the president needs the authority to prevent trading with the enemy in the midst of a war. And that seems to be the focus of this statute. So I guess I'm concerned about just sort of taking a particular word here and there and saying that the general view of it might include raising revenue, when in fact it looks as though the aim of this was really to give the president a certain kind of authority to freeze the assets of the enemy.
And let me say two things in response to that. First, as the notion that this is a revenue-raising tactic or power, it is not. We are asserting a regulatory power. It's a delegation of power to regulate foreign commerce. The way to control imports traditionally has been to tariff them. They say, well, you can impose quotas. Well, quotas are essentially economically equivalent to tariffs. So the question is, why would you be able to quota on to regulate but not tariff on to regulate when the tariffs are themselves regulatory? And let me turn back to the question I was giving, the response I was giving.
Could the answer be that in other places where Congress wants that particular form of regulation to be used, they say impose duties. They say you can tax, Mr. President. Here they don't say that.
I'd say two things in response to that. That's the very argument that this court rejected in Algonquin. That the fact that these other specific statutes,
If we disagree with you that Algonquin is a similar context, do you have another statute or another circumstance?
And again, I mean, not to do it again, but obviously we discussed that the phrase adjust imports. And they said, no, the natural way to do that is to tariff them. And they specifically said it makes no sense at all to authorize quotas, which was conceded that statute did authorize, but not tariffs, because those are equivalent.
It's not adjust by any means necessary, which kind of beefs up the adjust. And also, and this is actually, I just don't know the answer to this question, so maybe you can help and maybe the other side can help as well. Algonquin was very careful to always call it a license and a licensing fee. And in the oral argument that came up too, the distinction between a tariff and a licensing fee. And I can understand how in some contexts it would be very difficult. You would press on it and you would say, well, if this license fee is raising revenue, then it actually functions as a tariff. But what is the significance of that? Because in IEPA, it also says, it refers particularly to licenses. It says you can license, and license would be a way of giving permission. That's actually the language also used in the Civil War one, and
Yes, it does.
It was a license. It was a license fee, and that's a way to grant permission that you wouldn't otherwise have to trade and import and let it through. So tell me what the distinction is between licenses and fees, and if it matters.
It's hard for me to see one, because what President Lincoln said is, okay, we're going to allow imports from hostile foreign powers, basically rebellious Confederate states, of cotton subject to a license. But you got to pay 4 cents a pound of cotton when you do it. That's the condition. And that is so nearly equivalent to a tariff that says you can bring these goods to our country, but you got to pay an ad valorem assessment on it. And so, and of course, they have in their briefs conceded that quotas apply, that licensing may apply. There is the language in the beginning of 1701 that talks about instruments, or other methods of instruments licenses.
But if that was true, why couldn't you just call this a license? And it's also true that in the cotton example, the court said the exaction itself was not properly a tax, but a bonus required as a condition precedent for engaging in the trade. So it seems like it was a little squirrely about how it was proceeding. And if there really is no distinction, why couldn't you just call it a license here?
Very briefly, the other two cases, the Polk case and then the President McKinley case talk about duties. So I see the equivalence there, Mr. Chief Justice.
Thank you, Counsel. Justice Thomas, anything further?
The other side is going to make an argue on delegation, I believe. Would you anticipate that and give us your understanding of the delegation argument?
Yes, Justice Thomas, I'd say a couple things in response to that. First of all, this court has stated that the non-delegation doctrine does not apply with anything like the same force as it does in the domestic context in the foreign context. And that, again, to cite Dames and Moore again, Dames and Moore cites Youngstown, and Youngstown in footnote 2 of Justice Jackson's opinion. He goes into detail about this. He addresses Curtis Wright. He says there's a lot of broad dicta in Curtis Wright, but the holding of Curtis Wright, the ratio dissidenti, is that the domestic non-delegation doctrine does not apply with the same force in the foreign context. And then he uses that phrase, does not apply. He says the strict limitations on delegation that apply, in the internal context do not apply in the external context. And so we rely on that line of cases. And for the reason I talked about earlier, we were talking about a situation where the president has his own inherent authority to address foreign arising emergencies, and Congress is conferring tools on him that expand his ability, his capacity to do so. We are in the area of Youngstown Zone 1.
A few times you have alluded to the history as being important in interpreting the statute, and also that this language comes from the Trading with the Enemies Act, and that has its own pedigree. Could you just sketch out this direct line that you were alluding to as a basis for interpreting the current emergency statute as you would like it interpreted?
Yes, Justice Thomas, and turning back to the response I was giving to Justice Barrett earlier, there is, I think it's very well set out in Professor Baumside's amicus brief, there is this history of presidents using a tariffing power or a tariff equivalent power, very, very close to tariffing power, in wartime to tariff trading with enemies. And that is when the Trading with the Enemy Act was enacted in 1917, was deliberately evoking that. And when it brings in the power to regulate importation, it's essentially codifying for the inherent power the president's already recognized to have. And then in 1933, when that power is expanded to an area where he wouldn't inherently have it, the peacetime context, that codification, the meaning of that remains the same. The regulated importation language that's brought in from TWIA and ultimately to IEPA in 1977 is carrying with it that connotation, and that's reinforced by all the cases we cite in our brief where there's been extremely broad delegations of the power to tariff specifically and the power to regulate foreign commerce more generally, going back to the time of the founding, which ties to your question about non-delegation.
Justice Alito?
Luck is just when preparation meets opportunity. You need to step out and make sure that the town sees us.
I hate inside jokes. It's like, why not me involved?
Hey, Bill.
I hate all these commercials. Hold on. All right, let's see here.
That Congress, to the extent Congress had that decision in mind and relied on it, do you think it also relied on those statements in the opinion?
Not in the same way, because those statements are read into other provisions of TWIA that Congress did not enact in IEPA. They may still be there in TWIA, but those are limitations that it wouldn't make sense to do. And I think the significance of your sheet is at a higher level. Keep in mind that their principal position is no tariffs at all. Regulated importation just doesn't carry a connotation of the power to tariff. And we say we've got historical sources going back to give us against Ogden that say the opposite, but more fundamentally, everyone knew that at the time IEPA was enacted, that regulated importation had just very visibly and very prominently been upheld to include a sweeping global tariff.
Thank you. Mr. Sotomayor?
I'd like to go back to Justice Barrett's question on the word license as used in IEPA. It's not used as a verb, it's used as a noun. By the president may, under such regulations as he may prescribe, by means of instructions, licenses, or otherwise, then do what the verbs permit him to do. By license, he can nullify, void, prevent, or prohibit any acquisition, etc. So license is not being used as a verb that through licensing he can raise revenue. He can only use licenses to accomplish the verb.
I think they're missing the big point. the president is using tariffs to force manufacturers back to the United States so it increases our economic viability and military prowess. It's not about tax revenue or tariff revenue. It's about rebooting the manufacturing base. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the Gladiator Barley. This Gladiator Barley will help you to build muscle so you can fight the communists, bring down inflammation, soak up free radicals, and detoxify your body. By soaking up free radicals, detoxifying your body, and bringing down inflammation regularly, you're helping your immune system and endocrine system. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. In addition, bringing down inflammation regularly also helps you with brain function. Resveratrol is something that I've been taking for decades. This will help with youthful gene expression, help you to get rid of cells that are in senescence, soak up free radicals, and help the health of your mitochondria so you have more energy. Resveratrol stacks well with C60, ubiquinol, and NAD+, and Clarity Factor. Please go to my store and get the Resveratrol. Vitamin B complex, super important, especially if you're 40 years of age or older. Vitamin B complex, the first 4 B vitamins in this complex will help with the electron transport chain within your mitochondria so you have more energy, more ATP. Vitamin B complex will boost up your cellular metabolism, and vitamin B complex will also help to protect your neurons. Super important. You go to my store and get the dual purpose deodorants. You can get it in peppermint, lavender, and tea tree, and in citrus. These are made from essential oils from the Himalayas. No aluminum, no baking soda, all natural ingredients. It's dual purpose. You use it as a daily deodorant and it'll help to detoxify your body. It's for males and females. Get a couple bars for your household, help support the work that I do, and help support your health and wellness. Use discount 5 and you get $5 off any order. Back to oral arguments over at the Supreme Court.
I think that with respect to tariffs, if one thinks that a tariff is a taxing power, is a regulation of foreign commerce that is really delegated by the Constitution to Congress, that argument does not sound so well. And in fact, when you look at J.W. Hampton, which gives rise to the non-delegation test that we usually use, J.W. Hampton is a tariffs case. And the court did not say, oh, we need some special new principle here, some stricter rule because we're dealing with tariffs in which presidents are directly concerned as a matter of foreign relations. It enunciated the test we use for all non-delegations. So how does that fit with your theory?
8 years later, in Curtis Wright, the court held the non-delegation doctrine for domestic affairs does not apply with the same force as it does.
But not with respect to tariffs, not with respect to quintessential taxing powers, which are given by the Constitution to Congress.
I think justices of this court have recognized in their opinions that one of the reasons that the non-delegation doctrine, that intelligible principle test hasn't packed as much punch as Justice Kavanaugh said in one of his opinions as it might otherwise have done, is it did arise in the foreign affairs context, because there the court has historically been very, very comfortable with very broad delegations. Chicago and Southern Airlines on the case from the 1930s, shortly after J.W. Hampton talked about the very large delegations of the foreign commerce power being very effective. And of course, this goes back to the very dawn of the Republic in 1790, for example. Congress conferred on President Washington basically the entire Indian commerce power. He said, go, get licenses, right, to do commerce with the Indians, and they'll be subject to whatever rules and regulations President Washington can make. So I do think there's a profound consistency between the announcement of the intelligible principle test in J.W. Hampton and then the subsequent recognition by this court in Curtis Wright that the non-delegation doctrine doesn't apply the same force in this context.
In consumers research just last year, we had a tax before us, and the question was this a delegation issue? It was, of course, a much smaller tax, which dealt with many fewer taxpayers. Notwithstanding that, we said if there's no ceiling on this tax, we sort of assumed that if there were no ceiling on this tax, it would raise a delegation problem. And most of the opinion was given over to showing that there in fact was a ceiling on the tax, not a quantitative one, but a qualitative one. But how does your argument fit with the idea that a tax with no ceiling, a tax that can be anything, that here the president wants, there an agency wants, would raise a pretty deep delegation problem.
First of all, I can't say enough. It is a regulatory tariff, not a tax. And that, I think, ties to my response to that, which is that this is a totally different context. This is IEPA, a statute that Congress carefully crafted to grant the president admittedly broad powers to address foreign arising emergencies. It's outward facing to foreign affairs, where there's the broadest level of deference to the political branches. This court has recognized in many cases, and it imposed not a floor or limit on the amount of a tariff that can be imposed very naturally, because, for example, as this court said in Loving, quoting, Alexander Hamilton, Federalist number 23, it's impossible to foresee either what exigencies may arise or what tools may be needed to address those exigencies, means that may be required to address those exigencies. Instead, Congress granted very broad powers, but they're confined to a particular domain. This domain is any property in which any foreign government or any national thereof has any interest. So the sort of discipline, if one were to apply, we say shouldn't, but if you apply the non-delegation doctrine, the domestic-facing non-delegation doctrine in this context, there's a significant limitation there.
Yeah, so my last question really does have to do with that point, which is how or whether this is confined. Because if you look at Title 19, which is loaded with tariffs and duties of various kinds, all of them have real constraints on them. They are, you can't go over X%, or it can't last more than 1 year. And of course, the way you interpret this statute, it has none of those constraints. And the question arises why it is that any president ever would look to the tariffs in Title 19 if sub silentio, if you will, this statute gives the president the opportunity to blow past those limits.
This statute has its own constraints. They are constraints that are appropriate for the context, which is internationally arising emergencies. They were carefully crafted by Congress to address that, and they are admittedly different. They're in Section 1701. The president has to make a formal declaration of a national emergency, which subjects him to particularly intensive oversight by Congress, repeated, natural lapsing, repeated review, reports, and so forth. That says you have to consult with Congress to the maximum.
I mean, you yourself think that the declaration of emergency is unreviewable. And even if it's not unreviewable, it's of course the kind of determination that this court would grant considerable deference to the president on. So that doesn't seem like much of a constraint. And in fact, we've had cases recently which deals with the president's emergency powers, and it turns out we're in emergencies everything all the time about like half the world.
Well, this particular emergency is particularly existential, as Executive Order 14257 says, and of course, no one disputes the existential nature of the fentanyl crisis, which we had an agreement last week to create progress on, which illustrates the effectiveness of the tariffs tool here. But the point I would make in response to that is, those are, even if there's limited judicial review, which is very natural in the foreign affairs context, this court has always granted the president the presumption that he's acting in good faith. There are real hurdles there, very significant. It's got to be an unusual, extraordinary threat that arises in whole or substantial part outside the United States, so it's entirely foreign-facing into the national security, economy, or foreign policy of the United States. So there are those. Then there's 1701B, which talks about how it can be used for this and for no other purpose. Then there are limitations in Section 1702B. Then there is the limitations I referred to earlier about what he can actually do. He can do a heck of a lot, but only when he's dealing with property in which foreigners have an interest. And that's a pretty narrow domain. That's quite a silo, so to speak. And then, of course, overarching it all, there's congressional oversight, and you may say congressional oversight may not have much fight, but Congress didn't think so. Congress crafted this compromise. It balanced the never-ending tension. When it drafted AEPA, it had its eyes open. As the dissent below says, its eyes open looking at the problem of sweeping emergency powers for an executive who may use them in a way that's excessive versus the need to address unforeseeable.
Thank you, General.
Justice Gorsuch. General, just a few questions following up on the major questions discussions you've had. You say that we shouldn't be so concerned in the area of foreign affairs because of the president's inherent powers. That's the gist of it, as I understand it, why we should disregard both major questions and non-delegation. So could Congress delegate to the president the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations as he sees fit? To pay and collect duties as he sees fit?
We don't assert that here. That would be a much harder case now in 1790.
Isn't that the logic of your view, though?
I don't think so, because we're dealing with a statute that was a carefully crafted compromise. It does have all the limitations that I just talked about.
You're saying we shouldn't be concerned with. I want to explain to me how you draw the line, because you say we shouldn't be concerned because this is foreign affairs and the president has inherent authority, and so delegation off the books, more or less.
Well,
and if that's true, what would prohibit Congress from just abdicating all responsibility to regulate foreign commerce, for that matter, declare war, to the president?
We don't contend that he could do that. If it did.
Why not?
Well, because we're dealing with a statute again that has a whole.
I'm not asking about the statute, General. I'm not asking about the statute. I'm asking for your theory of the Constitution and why the major questions of non-delegation, what bite it would have in that case.
I would say by then you had moved from the area where there's enormous deference to the president, actually both the political branches, where here there's inherent authority, and pile on top of that there's a broad delegation.
You're saying there's inherent authority in foreign affairs, all foreign affairs. So regulate commerce, duties, and tariffs and war. It's inherent authority all the way down, you say. Fine. Congress decides tomorrow, well, we're tired of this legislating business. We're just going to hand it all off to the president. What would stop Congress from doing that?
That would be different than a situation where there are metes and bounds, so to speak. It would be a wholesale application.
You say we're not here to judge metes and bounds when the foreign affairs. That's what I'm struggling with. You'd have to have some test. And if it isn't the intelligible principle test or something more with more bite than that, you're saying something less. Well, what is that less?
I think what the court has said in its opinions is just that it applies with much less force, more limited application in this context. So perhaps the right to approach it is a very, very deferential application of the intelligible principle test. That's sort of wholesale application.
All right, so now you're admitting that there is some non-delegation principle at play here, and therefore major questions as well.
It's
right?
very limited, very, very deferential. And it is what, and again, the phrase that Justice Jackson uses, it just does not apply.
I know, but that's where you started off, and now you've retreated from that, as I understand it.
Well, I think we would have, as our frontline position, assert a stronger position, but if the court doesn't accept it, then if there is a highly
deferential... Can you give me a reason to accept it, though? That's what I'm struggling and waiting for. What's the reason to accept the notion that Congress can hand off the power to declare war to the president?
Well, we don't contend that. Again, that would
well, you do. You say it's unreviewable, and there's no manageable standard, nothing to be done, and now you're... I think you... tell me if I'm wrong. You backed off that position.
Maybe that's fair to say.
Okay, all right.
That would be an abdication. That would really be an abdication, not a delegation.
I'm delighted to hear that. All right, and then I want to return to something Justice Sotomayor asked under this statute. Okay, so now we're in the statute. It's a major question though. Could the president impose a 50% tariff on gas-powered cars and auto parts to deal with the unusual and extraordinary threat from abroad of climate change?
It's very likely that can be done. Very likely.
I think that has to be in the logic of your view.
Yeah, in other words, this administration would say that's a hoax, it's not a crisis, but...
I'm sure you would.
Yes, but that would be a question for Congress under our interpretation, not for the courts.
All right. And then on this inherent authority idea, I understand the president's inherent authority in wartime, and a lot of your examples of regulating commerce, and maybe your best one, Hamilton, during the Civil War, they occurred during wartime when the president's commander-in-chief power is clearly in play. Does the president have inherent authority over tariffs in peacetime?
No, we do not contend that.
Okay.
And in fact, I cite that, if I may, I point the court to two cases that are Loving against the United States and then Masery that's cited in Loving. Those are situations, for example, Loving against the United States, the president had broad Article 2 inherent authority. There was the commander-in-chief power. But this court held he does not have inherent authority to do the power that was delegated to him, right, which is the power to, identify aggravators that make you eligible for the death penalty in court-martial trials. And yet this court said, well, we're not going to see a delegation problem here, even though it's really a wholesale delegation, which would otherwise be legislative authority. It would be kind of like a small version of what your hypothetical would be an application. But because you're in a foreign affairs context or their commander-in-chief military context, where the president has his own delegation authority, he doesn't have the power to do this. But because of his background inherent authority, the court said, this is a situation where we're not going to see a delegation problem when there clearly would have been a delegation problem in the domestic context. In those cases, I think are powerful here.
General, if I can cut through those words, I think you're saying that no, the president doesn't have inherent authority over tariffs in peacetime.
Absolutely, that is, we do not assert that. We say that Congress can delegate that to him, and when Congress does so, as it does when it uses the phrase regulated importation.
I follow all of that. Okay. You emphasize that Congress can always take back its powers. I mentioned that a couple of times. But don't we have a serious retrieval problem here? Because once Congress delegates by a bare majority and the president signs it, and of course every president will sign a law that gives him more authority, Congress can't take that back without a supermajority. And even then, it's going to be veto proof. What president's ever going to give that power back? Pretty rare president. So how should that inform our view of delegations and major questions?
I would look at the balance that Congress struck, because what Congress did initially, it had a two-house legislative veto,
and we struck that down.
And then Congress went back to the Senate.
Yes, fair enough. As a practical matter, in the real world, you can never get that power back.
I disagree, because in January 2023, Congress voted to terminate one of the biggest IEPA emergencies ever, the COVID emergency, and the president went along with that. So what the statute reflects is there's going to be the ability for a sort of political consensus against a declared emergency.
What happens when the president simply vetoes legislation to try to take these powers back?
Well, he has the authority to veto legislation to terminate a national emergency, for example. I mean, he retains the powers in the background because IEPA is still on the books. But if he declares an emergency and Congress doesn't like it and passes a joint resolution, yes, he can absolutely veto that.
Yeah, so Congress, as a practical matter, can't get this power back once it's handed it over. The president's a one-way ratchet toward the gradual but continual accretion of power in the executive branch and away from the people's elected representatives.
I disagree with that, and the recent historical counterexample of Congress's termination of the COVID emergency demonstrates that political oversight
with the president's assent. With the president's assent, in fact,
once he lost it by a veto-proof majority in the Senate, I think the position. I think he realized, and that's the political process working. There was
it takes a supermajority, majority to get it back. Yeah. Okay. One other question. Do you think tariffs are always foreign affairs?
I do think they would. I can't think of a situation where they're not foreign facing. You're talking about tariffs on imports. I mean, maybe there are other tariff contexts that I'm not aware of, but yes, they typically would involve a foreign affairs thing. However, as against Ogden, if they are revenue-raising tariffs, they would not raise the same sort of like foreign affairs issues as regulatory tariffs, which are imposed not for the purpose of raising revenue, but to induce foreign powers to change their behaviors.
So revenue-raising tariffs are not foreign affairs, but regulatory tariffs are.
I don't think a revenue-raising tariff would be foreign affairs to the same degree, at least. I think it has a foreign application, obviously, but I don't think it would raise the same issues.
Okay. Thank you, General.
Justice Kavanaugh?
Figuring out what regulate importation means.
Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Get the turmeric. This will bring down inflammation and soak up free radicals. Ashwagandha root helps to control cortisol levels and control your blood glucose levels. Lignans will help with your immune system and your endocrine system. It brings down inflammation and soaks up free radicals. By stacking these together, you're going to slow down the aging process, boost up your immune system, and help with your cardiovascular system. Please go to my store, take my advice, get the turmeric, the ashwagandha, and the lignans, take them every day, slow down the aging process. But especially take it during the fall and the winter, because you need to boost up your immune system. Please go to my store and use discount 5.
Sir, one of your many answers to that is the Nixon example. And that's a good example for you, because Nixon relied on regulate importation to impose a worldwide tariff. Good example. What is our understanding of Congress in 1977 vis-a-vis that Nixon example when Congress reenacts or enacts the regulate importation language into IEPA?
Congress at that time was fully aware that a Court of Appeals of exclusive jurisdiction had interpreted that very phrase very visibly, very prominently to include the power to tariff, and then reenacted it without change. The court addressed a kind of lesser situation in Algonquin, when it came to Section 122, and the court said President Nixon Of course, President Nixon interpreted this to include a tariffing power, a tariffing-like power, and then Congress a few months later reenacted the language without change, and that's powerful evidence of congressional acquiescence. So that immediately historical background is very powerful, and it's buttressed, of course, by sources going back to the founding, where we say the phrase regulated importation. A quintessential application of that is the power to tariff. That's how you regulate.
Why, this may require some speculation on your part, economic philosophy, etc., but I'll ask it. Why do you think Presidents Clinton, Bush, Obama have not used IEEPA to impose tariffs on, because there have been trade disputes, and certainly, President Bush, steel imports and the like. Why do you think IEEPA has not been used?
If you look at those 69 emergencies, in fact, you go through them one at a time, which we had our team do, it's really hard to find one when you look at that emergency and you say, oh, tariffs is the natural tool you would use to address that emergency. So, for example, the blood diamond emergency, tariffing these sort of, criminal organizations in Africa that are financing terrorism with the sale of diamonds, you never really tariff them. Or you take, the Iranian hostage crisis, President Carter didn't say, oh, you seized all of our, embassy personnel, you're holding them hostage, we're going to tariff you, right? And if you go through those emergencies, there are two emergencies, where tariffs are the obvious natural tool for a president to use. One is the Nixon balance of payments deficit problem, and the other is this particular emergency. And also there's political reasons. I think that it's no question that President Trump is by far the most comfortable with the tariffs as a tool, both of economic and foreign policy, than many of the others presidents may have been. I mean, there are presidents like President Bush who, probably wouldn't have naturally, selected that particular tool or method. But if you go through all 69 of those intervening emergencies, what they have not done, at least, is they have not identified it. They say, oh, here's one where tariffs would be the obvious tool, but the president didn't use it.
Algonquin, as you've mentioned many times, is obviously very important here for us to understand exactly what's going on in Algonquin. The phrase there is different, adjust imports, and they really, the other side, your friend on the other side, really relies on the difference in language. I just want you to give your best answer to why regulate importation encompasses tariffs when we held that adjust imports would encompass monetary exactions.
Three answers, if I may. Adjust is narrower than regulate. And so, therefore, second answer, adjust is the second Black's Law Dictionary definition of regulate. The Black's Law Dictionary, our original plain meaning dictionary definition, says adjust by rule, mode, or rule, method, or established mode. So there's just a plain meaning link there. Regulate, adjust is a form of is a kind of regulation. And then I think far more important, regulate importation. I can't emphasize enough. Going back to the time of the founding has been understood that the manner in which you regulate importation, the natural way to do that is to tariff. So it'd be textually astonishing, given that historical pedigree, going back to Gibbons, going back to, Madison's letter to Cottrell, all the historical sources cited in our briefs. It'd be kind of astonishing to say, hey, President, you can regulate imports, but we're not saying this explicitly, but you do not have the power to tariff, when the tariffing is, in many ways, the quintessential way of regulating importation. So that historical pedigree sort of gives freight and meaning to that two-word phrase.
And last, you had some discussion about license fee versus tariffs, if there's distinction. I mean, the council in the oral argument in Algonquin said they're all monies exacted on imports, so in that sense, it certainly is a tariff, and hence all the incidence and the economic effect of a tariff. But we can't rely on what the council said in Algonquin. Isn't there a difference of sorts, at least, between a tariff and a license fee? You answered this, I think, briefly before, but I want to make sure, because I think this could be an important point, because I want to know Algonquin to decide this case. So give your best shot on that.
I agree that there is, maybe in mind, there's a formal distinction. But as a practical matter, I think what counsel was probably arguing there is that there really isn't much of an important distinction. And I would point to the passage in Algonquin where the court says, look, they conceded that this includes the power to quota, and since quotas are a quantitative method, it would make no sense for Congress not to grant the qualitative method, and all the more so here if there's a concession, as they do in some of the red bills.
One time the court said monetary methods, i.e. license fees, and the next page said monetary exactions, i.e. license fees and duties.
I think the court bought this.
It's important to be consistent.
There's really not a lot of daylight between those two. As a practical matter, certainly almost no daylight. And so then the question that
You say almost no daylight, just.
I mean, I would say that they're economic equivalents. Legally, they're pretty much the same. So I really don't see a big distinction there. And of course, the logic of Algonquin was, quantitative methods quotas are allowed. Therefore, it would make no sense at all to interpret this not to include the qualitative or the monetary exaction methods. Well, if we're talking about a distinction between regulated importation, including licenses that can come with fees, but not tariffs, that logic applies all the more. So it makes no sense.
Justice Barrett?
Well, I think in Algonquin, there was a formal distinction that mattered because at that oral argument, counsel pointed out that the uniformity clause would kick in and the constitutional uniformity requirement would apply to tariffs if it was that way, and speculated that the reason that the government may have set it up as a licensing scheme with licensing fees was to avoid that. So I do think there are some distinctions, but keeping that in mind, if you say that there really is, as a practical matter, no difference, this is kind of what I'm hung up on in license that maybe you can help. So in IEPA, Justice Sotomayor is right, license is used as a noun, but it's one of the means necessary. So in Algonquin, it was by any means necessary adjust. Here the statute says the president may, under such regulations as he may prescribe, by means of instructions, licenses, or otherwise regulate importation, which is the key part for our purposes. So the means it specifies are instructions, licenses, or otherwise. So I think it would, one argument might be that it would have been natural for Congress to put the president may, by means of instructions, licenses, tariffs, or otherwise. With an adjustum generis thing, I think you have to rely on the or otherwise, picking up more. Or if there really is no practical difference between licenses and tariffs, why aren't you making the argument, or why didn't the president structure this as a licensing fee scheme? How do I understand that language? Or am I just misunderstanding it and this language is totally irrelevant?
I think that, here's the way I respond to that. I think that language powerfully reinforces our position. It's the way you've laid it out right there. Because, first of all, regulated importation, we say, and based on extensive historical pedigree, the core application of that is tariffing. To list tariffing again would have been essentially redundant and unnecessary, especially if you look at the specific historical background of TWIA, where TWIA was enacting a tariffing power or a licensing-like power, that was described as, again, duties and tariffs equivalent.
Okay, but I don't understand, because I think you have to put together A1 and then B. So I think what you would be saying is he may prescribe by means of tariffs.
I think what you're saying is by means of instruments, licenses, or otherwise.
Instructions, licenses, or otherwise.
Instructions, licenses,
tariffs?
otherwise.
Okay.
That otherwise, if you say instructions, licenses, or otherwise, and we're asserting power that's very, very similar to licensing, otherwise naturally carries that with it. But that's not our principal position. Our principal position is regular importation means that.
Okay.
Right? So you don't need to say it again. However, if Congress has authorized them to do it by licenses that can come with fees that are economically equivalent to tariffs, and it says otherwise, that just reinforces the same conclusion that we use in the phrase.
Okay, then the question just to follow up on Justice Gorsuch's thing about how can Congress ever get this delegation back? You said, well, listen, you point to the Congress's ability to terminate emergencies, which it's done. But if Congress ever wanted to get the tariffing power back, it would have to have a veto-proof majority, because regardless of the emergency, so if Congress wanted to reject let's say that we adopt your interpretation of the statute. If Congress said, whoa, we don't like that, that gives the president too much authority under IEPA, it's going to have a very hard time pulling the tariff power out of IEPA, correct?
I don't know if it would be a hard time. Certainly we have to have a statutory amendment, which would be the true of any case where this court definitively interprets a statute. Yes, I think that.
But definitively interpreting a statute that grants presidential power makes it particularly hard to get the president to not want to veto something, which, as Justice Gorsuch is pointing out, has him lose power. All right, I want to ask you a question about unusual and extraordinary threat, which we have not talked about yet. And I specifically want to talk about the reciprocal tariffs. These are imposed on, these are kind of across the board. And so is it your contention that every country needed to be tariffed because of threats to the defense and industrial base? Spain, France, I could see it with some countries, but explain to me why as many countries needed to be subject to the reciprocal tariff policy as are.
Yeah, Executive Order 14257 spells out the nature of the emergency and basically says that there's this sort of lack of reciprocity, this asymmetric treatment of our trade with respect to foreign countries' trade that does run across the board. It is a global problem. And then that puts in context the argument they make that this power to tariff is so broad because you're applying to every country in the world. That conflates the nature of the tool, tariffing, which they're challenging here, with the nature of the declared emergency, which they haven't disputed. They haven't disputed, for example, that the president has correctly identified that virtually every major trading partner has this long-standing, so asymmetric, unfair treatment of all trade. So the argument this power is so broad, is really based on a conflation of two different things. One is the power, right? Imagine this. Imagine that, for example, President Reagan wanted to convince South Africa to change its apartheid policies, and he'd impose tariffs on them. No one would bat an eyelash and say, well, that's too broad, that can't be an IEPA. The power to tariff is fits naturally with all those powers to block, prohibit, and seize and so forth. But they're saying this is so broad because the emergency is so broad. But of course, that's a presidential determination and there's all kinds of basis for it. And also, keep in mind that the emergency is not like just the asymmetric treatment, it's the impact of the asymmetry, the underlying conditions, the hollowing out of our manufacturing base, the vulnerability of our supply chains, and of course, our defense industrial base's vulnerability of key inputs.
Justice Jackson?
So as I understand your response to Justice Barrett in that last question, you're saying that the power to tariff fits naturally with the power to block and seize. That was your example. But I guess I'm trying to understand then your argument from the text of the actual statute. Because the statute, unlike what you suggested to Justice Kagan, is focused on the actual actions that the president can take. In response to Justice Kagan, I understood you to say that Congress was giving the president broad authority to act, and it was within a particular domain, which is the domain of emergencies with respect to foreign power, but the president could basically do a lot of things. But when I read the statute, it is telling the president exactly what he can do: investigate, block during the pendency of an investigation, regulate, direct and compel, nullify, void, prevent, or prohibit. And I guess what is a little concerning to me is that your argument suggests that we should see the phrase imposed tariffs in that same series of things that the president could do. We don't see that word, and instead you take regulate and say that must mean that. So I guess I'm getting back to Justice Barrett's maybe original question, which was, where else in the code has Congress used the word regulate to sub in for imposed tariffs?
Yeah, and then this court's opinions, of course, have used regulate and import, or have pointed out that duties are the natural way to regulate foreign commerce.
But you're saying we should not have expected to see the same level of granularity with respect to the president's authority to impose tariffs as we see here: investigate, block, direct and compel, nullify, etc.
I think it would be very unusual for Congress to spell out all the ways that you can regulate in that.
So regulate becomes a big catch-all. The rest of the other things.
Well, I mean, we have a concession of that from the other side. That regulate at least includes qualitative methods, quantitative methods, quotas, licenses. They can see that regulate. There's a lot in regulate that's not spelled out there. And our point is, you don't need to spell out tariffs because that's like of all of them the most natural, the most quintessential method of regulating.
And yet, many presidents have not used regulate in this way to impose tariffs. I understand you point to President Nixon. We have licenses from Lincoln, but no one else.
Justice Kavanaugh, presidents who are faced with international crises to which tariffing is the natural response. That's President Nixon and President Trump have invoked this authority. And also, frankly, President Trump invoked this authority in May of 2019 as well.
Can I ask you one question?
Historically attested that they can see.
Let me just ask one more question about the unusual threat. So in your conversation with Justice Gorsuch, that we had the climate change tariff hypo, and you indicated that there would be challengers to the notion that that was an unusual and extraordinary threat. And I'm just wondering, under your position, would they be able to make a legal challenge? Are you saying the court would not be able to review?
On that particular hypothetical, I think I said that would be a question for Congress.
So not
I know that would be the sort of thing the courts would want to wade into. Is this really an emergency? that would not be probably very unlikely. That'd be a situation where at least there'd be very, very, very deferential judicial review of that kind of determination.
No, I'm asking, right, those are two different things. Is there no judicial review or is there deferential review?
Our frontline, I mean, Trump against Hawaii, our frontline position is that it's ultimate inspector, it's committed to the president's discretion when he makes his determination of a national emergency. But the court doesn't have to decide that because whatever review is very, very deferential, it's easily satisfied.
Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Mr. Cottrell?
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court. Tariffs are taxes. They take dollars from Americans' pockets and deposit them in the U.S. Treasury. Our founders gave that taxing power to Congress alone. Yet here, the president bypassed Congress and imposed one of the largest tax increases in our lifetimes. Many doctrines explain why this is illegal, like the presumption that Congress speaks clearly when it imposes taxes and duties, and the major questions doctrine. But it comes down to common sense. It's simply implausible that in enacting IEEPA, Congress handed the president the power to overhaul the entire tariff system and the American economy in the process, allowing him to set and reset tariffs on any and every product from any and every country at any and all times. And as Justices Gorsuch and Barrett just said, this is a one-way ratchet. We will never get this power back if the government wins this case. What president wouldn't veto legislation to rein this power in and pull out the tariff power? IEEPA is a sanction statute. It's not a tax statute where Congress gave away the store. Congress knows exactly how to delegate its tariff powers every time for 238 years. It's done so explicitly, always with real limits. IEEPA looks nothing like those laws. It uses regulate, which Congress has used hundreds of times, never once to include tariffs, and it lacks the limits of every other tariff statute. And that is why, even though presidents have used IEEPA to impose economic sanctions thousands of times, no president in IEEPA's 50-year lifetime has ever tried to impose tariffs. And the president bypassed statutes that do address tariffs, like Section 122 for large and serious trade deficits, but that imposes a clear guardrail, 15% cap, 150-day limit. This is Youngstown at its lowest ebb. If the government wins, another president could declare a climate emergency and impose huge tariffs without fines or without floors or ceilings, as Justice Gorsuch said. My friend's answer, this administration would declare it a hoax. The next president may not quite say that. This is an open-ended power to junk the tariff laws and is certainly not conveyed by the word regulate. I welcome the court's questions.
Wouldn't your argument also apply to embargoes?
So, and this is the argument in the fine dissent below, and I think there are three answers to that, Justice Thomas. The first is revenue raising. Embargoes stop the shipment. Tariffs start the tax bill. They are first and foremost ways of regulating revenue. As some of your own opinions said, this is the way we actually chiefly got revenue for the first 100 years of our republic. Tariffs are constitutionally special because our founders feared revenue raising, unlike embargoes. You know, there was no Boston embargo party, but there was certainly a Boston Tea Party. The second thing, textually, in the statute, it's different. Regulate appears in a cluster of verbs, as was said before, investigate, block, nullify, and the like. They describe embargo-like controls, prevent and prohibit, for example. But they don't describe revenue exactions. That's Justice Kagan's point. The one verb that's missing here is anything about raising revenue whatsoever. Another point, congressional displacement. Today, there's a whole host of statutes in the tariff architecture of Title 19, which both expressly confer the power to tariff and always impose clear limits. Embargoes by the president, embargoes don't have any of that. They don't set aside that whole thing. If you look at the Learning Resources Brief at page 5, it goes through these statutes in detail. Section 122 expressly says duties and then limits it, 15%, 150 days. Section 201, any duty on the imported article, but it requires ITC findings. Section 301, impose duties. That's the language of the statute, but all sorts of procedural restrictions. Section 338, the same. I can go through this, and I can start, by the way, Justice Thomas, with the statutes at the founding, all of which expressly said the word tariff or an equivalent.
Let's go back to your non-delegation point. It would seem that if the tariff power cannot be delegated, your argument on non-delegation would also have to apply to embargoes and to quotas.
No, Your Honor, because I think tariffs, because they're uniquely revenue raising, impose special, unique concerns that go back to our founding.
Enterprise data teams are facing a turning point. Regulations are tightening, AI is reshaping the data landscape, and budgets are under immense pressure. Existing data integration platforms weren't built for today's complexity.
What did Congress not do? And this is why the example cuts the other way. They never gave the president any sort of delegation of tariff authority at the time. Our point is not you can't delegate tariff authority. It's simply that you've got to do so with intelligible principles. And what you just heard my friend say is every single limit in AIPA is one that is not judicially enforceable. There's no limit whatsoever. And indeed, the main limit that was in there, he calls this some compromise position. The only compromise in 1977 was the legislative veto. And as this case comes to the court, that's no longer in the statute at all.
So yes, sure, the tariffs are a tax, and that's a core power of Congress. But they're a foreign-facing tax, right? And that foreign affairs is a core power of the executive. And I don't think you can dismiss the consequences. I mean, we didn't stay in this case, and one thing is quite clear is that the foreign-facing tariffs have in several situations.
Right, and we are.
I'm sorry. Were quite effective in achieving particular objectives. So I don't think you can just separate it when you say, well, this is a tax, Congress's power. It implicates very directly the president's foreign affairs power.
Mr. Chief Justice, we don't disagree with a large part of that. We think instead of thinking about foreign versus domestic, the better way of thinking about it is Article 1 versus Article 2. And as my friend finally conceded to Justice Gorsuch, there is no Article 2 power here, at least when we're talking about peacetime.
Well, you don't agree with a large part. What's the little part that you do disagree?
So we agree with the idea that tariffs have foreign policy implications. Absolutely. Our founders recognize that. That's in the Federalist Papers. But nonetheless, they exclusively committed that power to the Congress in Article 1, Section 8, and gave it as its first power. So when you hear my friends cite cases like Egan and Garamendi, they just don't apply to this specific unique situation in which Congress is given that power. And if you were tempted by this, I think the best place to look is Youngstown, because what Justice Jackson said, and I was surprised that he quoted pages 652, because what Justice Jackson said is, quote, emergency powers tend to kindle emergencies, so it's essential the public may know the extent and limitations of the powers that can be asserted and persons affected may be informed from the statute of its rights and duties. And Justice Jackson went on to say there that it's notable our founders didn't give the president revenue-raising power even in a time of war.
Can I just get a clarification of your answer, which is you agree if the word tariff were in the statute, that would be acceptable and constitutionally permissible, correct?
No, it'd be constitutionally permissible. The question would then be, is the open-ended assertion of power here? Because every other
I get it as applied to this case, but the general point is, yes, Congress, you said it's assigned to Congress, but Congress can grant authority to presidents to impose tariffs. Absolutely. As a general proposition. Absolutely. Okay, so we have to figure out then what regulate importation means. And you've heard my questions. If this statute came out of nowhere in 1977, I think your case would be, obviously stronger. We have to figure out, at least I want to figure out what the Nixon precedent stands for and what Algonquin stands for. On the Nixon precedent, the question is, I think, was Congress aware of that, meaning that when they used regulated importation and it's now being used to encompass tariffs, that's not unheralded because Congress was well aware. President Nixon announced those tariffs in a nationwide primetime speech, 10% across the board in August 1971. It was not some kind of little piece of paper. So it was well known. The question then is, was Congress, why didn't they change the language? Why didn't they say regulate but not tariffs? That's kind of the difficult question from the Nixon precedent that I'll give you an opportunity to answer.
Thank you, Justice Kavanaugh. So 5 answers on the Nixon precedent. First, There is no evidence.
Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the collagen. This will help with your skin, your nails, your hair, your cartilage, your joint health, musculature, and bone density. It's dual purpose. Take it every day. Make sure you do some resistance training. Also, heirloom barley helps to bring down inflammation, detoxify your body, and soak up free radicals. By taking this every day, which this is a month's supply, you're going to help to improve your immune system and your endocrine system. And detoxifying your body is super important to slow down the aging process. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the heirloom barley. And stack it with the Boomer Boost. Boomer Boost is 68 nutrients. It has a very comprehensive profile compound. Take it with soft foods. This is a month's supply. You can also take it with filtered water, smoothie, or just with milk, but take it every day. This will help with your vascular system, your heart health, brain function, boost up your energy levels and metabolism, and help with your musculature. Take it every day, slow down the aging process. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Use discount 5, you get $5 off any order.
And then even if you thought that Congress knew about Yoshida, and even if you thought they liked it, which there's absolutely zero evidence of, I don't think that helps the government for reasons that Justice Alito was pointing to, because Yoshida said 3 things. A, TWIA doesn't give the unlimited authority that the government is seeking here. B, they were only upholding the limited specific assertion of authority that President Nixon sought there. And third, going forward, the solution, they said in footnote 33, was to use Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act, 15%, 150 days. So we have no problem with the president doing that. It's just that this president has torn up the entire tariff architecture. You know, for example, he's tariffing Switzerland, one of our allies, which we have a trade surplus, 39%. That is just not something that any president has ever had the power to do in our history. And the idea that Congress, by implication, did this in 1977 and handed him all this power, I think is really difficult.
Just ask the other, go ahead.
Let's start with just the bare statutory language. You have arguments about structure, you have arguments about history. There are strong arguments, but let's just start with the bare statutory language. Regulate importation. If we disregard all of the rest, would you dispute that that would include the imposition of a fee?
So if it's revenue, yeah, we do dispute that, absolutely.
What if there were a statute that said, I mean, suppose that there's a particular national park that's very crowded, and Congress passes a statute that says the National Park Service may regulate admission to the park. Would you say, well, that does not allow them to impose a fee?
So, you know, sometimes we think of fees as not revenue raising, but rather capturing the cost of government services in your example. The going to the park, that made, you know, those kinds of cases, which I think
suppose it goes beyond the cost of running the park. Congress just wants to control admission to the park, regulate admission. Wouldn't that include the imposition of the fee?
So if it doesn't raise revenue, then and it's not about that, then I think that's fine. If it does,
it raises revenue. That's
I think it's a tougher
hypothetical. That wouldn't apply.
So I think in that circumstance that it wouldn't be a regulation in context. It wouldn't be permitted. That is, at least in the context of tariffs and trade, we know Justice Alito.
Well, that gets into your other arguments. We start out with the bare statutory language, and that was what my question was about. Do you think all tariffs are revenue raising? Suppose that instead of imposing these across the board tariffs, suppose that an executive order imposed a tariff on one particular country and provided that this would take effect in 90 days. And suppose that within those 90 days, an agreement is reached with that country so that no tariff is ever collected. Would that be a revenue-raising tariff?
I take it the additional point and on its face, it is revenue raising, that's what it's for. And so I think that would. And look, I don't doubt that there are edge cases. That is what this court's confronted just recently in FCC versus Consumer Research. And you said, look, what is a tax is sometimes very hard. What is revenue raising? This is obviously revenue raising. Their own brief to the court says it's going to raise $4 trillion. And Justice Alito, you and your Consumers Research dissent, or Justice Gorsuch's dissent that you joined, said taxation is special and different. And it is the most powerful thing the government does. And the idea that Congress, when they know exactly how to write tariff and tax statutes, gave this power by implication through the word regulate, I think is very, very hard.
You cite many different statutory provisions that impose tariffs. And you have a point if that's the relevant universe. What if the relevant universe is tariffs that are imposed in emergency situations?
Yes, so I think it cuts the other way. So, as Justice Jackson said, it's when you're in an emergency situation, the statutes actually have to speak with more precision. The public needs to know because emergencies beget emergencies. And I would say the best way of understanding what Congress does in emergencies is to look at their emergency statutes. Not one has ever given the president a taxation power or a tariff power. We've had all sorts of emergencies for 238 years. No president has ever said, oh, the way to deal with that is I need to have a tariff authority. And as Justice Sotomayor said, IEPA gives already a quota power, so you can get what the foreign policy piece of it is through that. I'd also say, Justice Alito, James and Moore, which the Chief Justice referred to earlier, I think is really important here because the Solicitor General in that case made a similar argument to what you just heard on the claims provisions. He said it falls within regulate. Regulate is a capacious term. He said, Justice Alito, what you said, this is an emergency situation. And he said you've got to defer to the president on a major issue of national security about this very statute. And what did the court do? It rejected those arguments and said IEPA doesn't cover these.
You say that this is not, this case does not, that these executive orders do not address an unusual and extraordinary threat. I understand that argument. Suppose that the facts were that it was suppose that there was an imminent threat of war, not a declared war, but an imminent threat of war with a very powerful enemy whose economy was heavily dependent on U.S. trade. Could a president under this provision impose a tariff as a way of trying to stave off that war? Or would you say no? President lacks that power.
Couldn't you tariff, could you quota embargo, all of those things?
Could do all those things, but the president could not impose a tariff. There's one thing he couldn't do.
There's a category shift between a tariff and the other 8 powers in IEPA because it is revenue raising, so it's not a difference in degree or something like that. That's why, I don't doubt tomorrow.
Even if the purpose of this had nothing whatsoever to do with raising 1 penny. The president didn't want to raise 1 penny. The president wanted to deter aggression that would bring the United States into a war. He would say, no, can't do that.
Yeah, just so you know, I think you've said many times the purpose isn't what you look at. You look to actually what the government is doing. And if you disagree, if you think we're, if you think, or excuse me, if you ruled for us and the president says, I need this power, he can go across the street to Congress tomorrow and get it by a simple majority through reconciliation. But if you vote for them, this power, as Justice Gorsuch said, as Justice Barrett said, is going to be stuck with us forever. The power to judge.
Can I ask you? I just wanted to give you a chance to address kind of the other argument that's been submerged here textually. Again, just bare text for a moment, okay? We've been focused on regulate importation, but actually the statute says the president may, by means of licenses or otherwise, regulate importation. And we've had some discussion today about the fact that maybe the president could simply recharacterize these tariffs as licenses or rejigger the scheme so that they are licenses. We've also heard the suggestion that otherwise, licenses and tariffs are very similar, so otherwise might encompass tariffs there. Thoughts?
Yeah, a few thoughts, Justice Gorsuch. First is the SG is not even making that argument, and I think they're not making it for a number of reasons. One is that there's a strong presumption against reading statutes this way in the unique tax and duties context. Hartramp is one of those cases which says if there's doubt, you don't read the statute to confer such powers. Second, if you were to do that, it's open-ended. It allows, and this was your hypothetical, it allows under the word license then to tariff the world,
It seems like you're putting a major questions thumb or an interpretive lens thumb on the plain text there. Is that fair?
I think you could call it major questions. I just think it's like Justice Barrett said in Nebraska versus Biden, the most natural way of understanding what the statute is about. We're talking about, under the government's reading, a statute that gives the power to the president to junk the entire...
I understand that, but you're not disputing licenses or otherwise means what it says. You're saying we should interpret that narrowly for particular reasons.
So I think I am disputing it as well. I think the licenses, and this is something Justice Sotomayor was saying, don't expand the power. They are not verbs. And so it is limited to the 9 verbs there.
I understand that.
And so regulate, I don't think.
Thank you, Counsel. Justice Thomas, anything further?
I'd like to just revisit the point that Justice Alito was making with a similar question. If one of our major trading partners, for example, China, held a U.S. citizen hostage, could the president, short of embargoing or setting quotas, say the most effective way to gain leverage is to impose a tariff for the purpose of leveraging his position to recover our hostage?
No, Your Honor. So tariffs are different because they're revenue raising, and I think it goes to the point I was saying to you in our very first colloquy, which is quotas, embargoes, and stuff are different for a different reason, which is there's a tariff architecture around Title 19, in Title 19, that in tariff would, like in your hypothetical, would supersede. And here the president is seeking the power to set aside all of our trade treaties unilaterally under the word regulate. I just don't think it can bear that weight.
Justice Alito?
You mentioned other tariff provisions that you think would be rendered redundant if we adopted the government's interpretation of IEPA. One that you didn't mention, which is discussed in an amicus brief, is Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. Why doesn't the plain language of that provision, which does speak specifically about duties, provide a basis for all or virtually all of the tariffs that are at issue here?
Yeah, the government's never made that argument, Justice Alito, and I think for very good reason, because it only applies to MFN violations, which are not at issue here. You can only tariff if the president finds as a fact that a country satisfies 2 conditions, including that it discriminates against the United States. There are also a host of other reasons why Section 338 may have lapsed, and that's why no president has ever used it. But look,
what is the argument that it's lapsed? It's regrettable, and we put this case on a very expedited schedule. Therefore, there are limitations on what and the party's ability to answer each other's arguments or arguments that are made by amici. The amicus brief says that it hasn't lapsed. There are articles that say it hasn't lapsed. What is your argument? What is the basis for your argument that it lapsed?
So 2 things, Justice Alito. Sections 252 and 301 have been understood by many to have superseded Section 338. And second, I don't think you have to get into this issue at all. We're not here saying that the government doesn't have a 338 power. That's something that can be decided by other courts at other times. As these folks come to the court, as the government comes to the court today, they're citing one statute and one statute only, IEPA, and we submit to you, it doesn't come even close to authorizing these worldwide tariffs.
Well, what if the president tomorrow were to say, I'm reissuing these executive orders and I'm invoking, in addition to other authorities, Section 338 of the Tariff Act,
so
1930.
I think at that point we'd have that case. I mean, I'm not here to say that 338 does or doesn't do one thing. I'm responding to the government's argument, which is the invocation of IEPA and IEPA alone. But perhaps that point, Justice Alito.
So again, I understand party presentation and all of that, and not being a court of first view. But in these circumstances, if that were to happen, and it might be a realistic possibility, you think, well, okay, then the government would continue to try to collect these tariffs, and the plaintiffs here would have to go back to the Court of International Trade or the district court and challenge it again, and it would have to progress through those lower courts and come back to us when? A year from now? 6 months from now? While the tariffs continue to be collected and the amount that's at stake amounts into the billions. I mean, what are we at now? 100 billion? We get up to $1 trillion? That's what you're suggesting?
So, Justice Alito, I think a few things. One is, I think it's rich for the government to be making this argument about the refunds undermining us, because they opposed the preliminary injunction in this case by saying, oh, don't worry, we'll give the refunds later. And they sought a stay in the federal circuit on exactly that ground, which was, you don't need to implement the federal circuit's decision because we'll give the refunds later on. And now they're suggesting.
Well, that wasn't my question, Mr. Cottrell. The question was whether it would make more sense for us to address that, if that is a possible justification for these tariffs, for us to address that now and get it over with, rather than having this continue for who knows how long while it goes through the procedures in the lower courts.
Justice Alito, I think that is forfeited 9 ways to Sunday. This amicus brief has been filed in every single stage of this case. The government's never embraced that argument. For them to be able to do so now, I think is way, way too late. But I do think if you ruled, as we're suggesting you do, against the government, they can go and try and seek to use other authorities, whether it's 338, Section 122, etc. Those are the ways prescribed by the Congress. And as Justice Kavanaugh was saying earlier, every other president has used all this suite of other authorities, 201 for steel, for autos and things like that, 301 for countries like China. This president has come along and said something different, and with all due respect, we don't think IEPA allows him to do this junking of the worldwide tariff architecture.
And what was the view, what were the views of President Trump's immediate predecessors on the question of imposing tariffs or allowing free trade? What was their policy view on that question?
There's been a variety of different views about that, but the executive order, my friend said, well, prior presidents had no occasion to use the tariff power, which is belied by the very executive order he's defending here, which says that the trade deficits have been large and persistent every single quarter since 1976. And we've had trade wars. President Reagan initiated different ones and the use of different authorities, but never once did a president try and seek IEPA as the basis to rewrite the entire tariff code.
I found it interesting to hear you make the non-delegation argument, Mr. Cottrell. I wonder if you ever thought that your legacy as a constitutional advocate would be the man who revived the non-delegation argument.
Heck yes, Justice Alito. I think Justice Gorsuch nailed it on the head when saying that when you're dealing with a statute that is this open-ended, unlike anything we've ever seen, to give the president this kind of power, yes, this isn't just delegation running riot. This is delegation that's a legislative.
Wouldn't you agree that statutes that confer on the president real emergency powers are often phrased much more broadly than other statutes? Isn't that the very nature of an emergency? I know you dispute the fact that this is a real emergency. Maybe it's not. But isn't it the very nature of an emergency provision that is going to be more open-ended?
So, Justice Alito, we think it actually cuts the other way, as I was saying earlier. That's what Justice Jackson said. And, you already confronted that in James and Moore and said it's not that open-ended, even though it's an emergency. And by the way, other emergency statutes have very serious limits. Section 122 is literally about President Nixon's proclamation of an emergency. That's what it's about, and it's limited 15%, 150 days.
And what about the authorization?
Grip, stability, precision. That's the essence of driving. Lawful.
Every time I open that spreadsheet, my soul left my body. I have that too, but I switched to Pipedrive.
This is how I always pictured sales in my
Do here.
Of course not, because there you have shared powers between the president in Article 1 and Article 2 powers. That's what I was saying.
Well, it gets into the question of whether it was delegated or not. What was the scope of the delegation?
Absolutely, but there, it's military. There's a whole unique history behind that. But here you're talking about something that is exclusively committed to Congress in Article 1. And there, yes, when you have delegations, I would say, Justice Alito, even when you have delegations in some military cases, in emergency statutes, they have all sorts of limits. So 10 U.S.C. 2808 says that in a declaration of war or a national emergency, the president can, quote, undertake military construction necessary to support emergency use of the armed forces, but it has limits.
Mr. Miller?
I'm fascinated that the two instances where presidents have used their war powers to impose a tariff, Lincoln and Nixon, that Congress found it necessary to ratify their actions. And that the court in both those cases, the intermediate Court of Appeals in Nixon and our own court, included that as part of their reasoning, as justifying the use of war power in that situation. So I'm a little concerned why the fact that this act, a domestic act on emergency, that uses a general word like regulate, should take on a war powers meaning when in every other situation, whenever Congress intended domestic taxation, it said tax and regulate.
Oh, Justice Sotomayor, I wish I had an hour to talk about this with you, because this argument by the government advanced in their reply brief is wrong, every which way.
I'm saying that's your sixth way of differentiating Brighteon, correct?
So
that was a war powers case.
So it's a war powers case about conquered territory. It has nothing to do whatsoever with domestic tariffs. And absolutely, you're right in saying that the way that court, even in those cases, even at the height of the government's power, war powers, they said Congress had to ratify it, and that's what in page 96.
And that hasn't happened here.
That has not happened here, not even close.
Well, it might not when Congress closed, but they can't even think about it right now. I'm going to assume, and maybe he can shake his head yes or no, that Justice Kavanaugh will ask you to go to Algonquin, which he didn't answer, and he's shaking his head. So I'll let him do that part, okay?
Excellent. Algonquin, Your Honor, is
No, I'll let him do it.
Oh, sorry.
He can. It was his question, but I want to make sure you get to it.
We'll hear from Justice Kagan first.
I have one specific question, one more general question. The specific question is, does it matter in the way we think about IEPA, what Congress thought it was doing in IEPA, what IEPA in fact did? That at the time, Congress thought it had available to it a legislative veto.
I do think it's relevant, at least for delegation purposes, because, as this case comes to the court, the one check that was in there, the so-called compromise, is a legislative veto which now no longer exists. And that's why I said to Justice Alito, this statute now looks unlike any other statute with respect to...
I guess I'm wondering whether, though, it cuts against you as well, that Congress thought it had a legislative veto, so it didn't put in a variety of checks that it might have put in had it not thought it had a legislative veto, and, that's just tough luck on Congress now.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, Justice Kagan, I think is a very tough common sense argument to make, because every single delegation of tariff power statute from Congress to the president always has limits, and including, Section 122 passed just right before IEPA had, in the case of the exact problem that this executive order is dealing with, large and serious trade deficits, it said the way to deal with it is 15%, 150 days. The idea that 3 years later they just said, oh no, junk the rule book, I think is very difficult, and no Congress, I think, would rely just on the legislative veto for such a thing of such momentous importance. As you said to my colleague earlier, why would any president look to all of the different tariff statutes in Title 19 if you can just IEPA them all, French Revolution them all?
General Sauer rests a lot on the president's inherent authority. And I want to make sure I understand your answer to the Chief Justice and to Justice Alito as to where you think that authority exists in a way that actually would affect our interpretation of a statute, and where you think it doesn't, and why this falls into the second category.
Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the C6E. This is a very potent antioxidant. It's 1,000 times more potent than vitamin C. This will soak up free radicals, reduce stress in the cell and in the extracellular matrix, even in your vascular system and your brain, in your neurons. It's really important to reduce that stress, soak up those free radicals, allow for your mitochondria to boost up the ATP levels. That's very important for your neurons. And when you're soaking up free radicals, you're slowing down the aging process. At the vascular level, by soaking up free radicals, you're reducing plaque formation. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the C60. Take a teaspoon a day, every day. You can get it in a 2 ounce, a 4 ounce, or an 8 ounce configuration. You can get it in avocado oil, extra virgin olive oil, or MCT coconut oil.
Mrs. Gorsuch? Well, I don't know if I agree with what you say, but at any rate, back to the plain language, and just stick with me for a moment. You know, the Constitution says that Congress gets to regulate commerce, and everybody understood that that meant and included the power to tariff. Story, Madison, okay? So that's sort of a problem, right? And regulate is a capacious verb. And then you've got the otherwise language as well, which we sort of discussed. And just on the plain language, forget about the backdrop of major. Do you need major questions to win? I kind of think you might.
No, I don't think so. I mean, if we did, I think we'd win for reasons expressed, but I don't think so at all. So Justice Gorsuch, our position is not that regulate can never mean tax or tariff.
Okay.
Our brief at page 15 gives you an example. A president may regulate cars coming in to the city, and then if it adds by charging tolls or something like that, absolutely, in context it does. Here, the context you're referring to, story and so on, says nothing about this case. That is the constitutional context about Congress's use of power.
But it's part of how we understand language is used, and it's relevant for that purpose. And then when you've got licenses, which are economically the same thing as, would you agree they're basically economically the same thing as tariffs?
Sometimes they can be.
Okay, so you've got something that's economically identical to a tariff, authorized by this statute. So where does that leave you?
So let me
take
the question in two parts. One is about the word regulate, and the other is about licensing. With respect to the word regulate, when it's used in the constitutional sense, it's very different than the sense in IEPA that my friend is asserting. When we're asserting IEPA, we're talking about a statute that is granting the president massive powers. And so the relevant context that I think you look at in asking the question, what did Congress mean in 1977? The best context, the most natural context is, what does Congress say every time they grant the president such power? And then, there's just the one other point on this. Constitutions are read totally differently. Story and Madison are talking about the constitutional phrase, and as Chief Justice Marshall said in McCulloch, a constitutional expounding the prolixity of the legal code is the opposite of the way you read the Constitution.
I do follow that argument. Okay. What about otherwise? Again, I just really want to make sure I understand. You say that there's a good reason why the Solicitor General didn't make that argument. I'll be curious to see what he has to say about that. But you know, what's your best reasoning why the otherwise language?
Because it's only a mechanism to implement the 9 powers, and that licenses sometimes can be revenue raising and sometimes not.
Yeah.
And so
if licenses can be revenue raising, and you can do this otherwise through revenue raising things, why wouldn't that capture tariff?
So because I think again, our point to you is that that there's two kinds of licenses come in 2 flavors. If an executive order is asserting a license fee to recoup the cost of government services or something like that, as I was saying to Justice Alito, that doesn't look different than the other verbs. That's not revenue raising. It doesn't implicate the founder's concern. It doesn't implicate the concerns you wrote about in consumers' research about the fear of the government.
You're not answering my question though, Mr. Cottrell. I'm talking about just plain text here. And you're moving to a major questions or a non-delegate. That's the move you're making, which I think, fine, we can consider that. I'm just talking about the text, okay? It says by means of licenses or otherwise. You concede that licenses are economically equivalent to tariffs. And the statute says by means of licenses or otherwise.
Right.
Regulate.
It's only a means, and we looked at the
It's a means.
Yeah.
Why isn't tariffs a permissible means on the statute?
Because again, it has to be related to the 9 powers.
Well, license can be. We have to acknowledge that. And you said a license can raise revenue, and you said a license is equivalent to a tariff economically. So what about otherwise?
So Justice Gorsuch, if the license or the otherwise is raising revenue, then it is a difference in kind from the other verbs. And we looked at the history of licenses under TWIA, and we were not able to find any involving licenses or license fees.
Okay. Last question, a little further afield. The parties discussed a little bit the analogy to the Foreign Commerce Clause. Of course, next to it is the Indian Commerce Clause. And delegations there were very broad initially and involved licenses once again. And why shouldn't that inform our understanding of the Foreign Commerce Clause?
I don't know that I have a position on that. It maybe is a little too afield for me to.
Well, if the president has broad authority in one part of the Commerce Clause, why wouldn't he in the next door neighbor?
Oh, I see. Because here Congress has specifically been given the exclusive power over tariffs, and so if they're to part with it, I think, as this court has said in J.W. Hampton, which is a tariffs case.
You say the same principle would apply with tariffs with the Indian Commerce Clause. Is it tariff-specific argument?
I think it's at least intelligible principles is what this court has used for tariffs specifically, and we think that's the way you should look at this. And then under intelligible principles, this is miles away from any delegation we have ever seen.
Thank you.
Justice Kavanaugh?
Just on the Nixon point, because you said, I think, that the current tariffs are unprecedented. I mean, that was a 10% worldwide tax on every import into the United States, I believe. I mean, we don't need, I just think that's a fact. You have arguments about that. You made good arguments about that, but just wanted that point to be clear. On Algonquin, to pick up on Justice Sotomayor's kind assist, your argument here is that the statute has to use the word tariffs, I think, basically. And we went through Nixon and Yoshida, but then Algonquin, the statute for 232, does not use the word tariffs. It uses adjust imports. And President Ford had imposed, again, a pretty significant tariff on oil imports. It was challenged. It got to this court. Attorneys standing where you are stood up and said the license fee now before the court involves the broadest exercise of the tariff power in the history of the American Republic. In fact, we would have to go back to George III's stamp tax to determine as broad an executive power as claimed in this case. The statute is a simple one. It does not mention the tariff on its face. The argument there was the word tariff was not mentioned, used to adjust imports. The court, obviously 9-0, rejects that argument, in part because, as others have pointed out, the court does a lot of questioning, what's the difference between a quota and a tariff? And what's the difference between an embargo and a tariff? And so when the court writes the opinion, it says we find no support in the language of the statute, the language, for respondents' contention that the authorization of the president to adjust imports should be read to encompass only quantitative methods, i.e. quotas, as opposed to monetary methods, i.e. license fees of affecting such adjustments. So, on your basic point that you need the word tariff, Algonquin says you don't need the word tariff. And that was President Ford's oil imports. It's 9-0. The oral argument goes through this. Your answer.
There's a lot there, Justice Kavanaugh, so please bear with me. First, I'd like to clarify what our position is generally and then deal with Algonquin. Our position is not that you have to use the word tariff or any other magic word. It's true that Congress has used a specialized vocabulary since the founding, since 1790, using words like tariffs or duties. But as I was saying earlier to Justice Gorsuch, you could even use the word regulate, as our page 15 of our brief says, or you can even imagine something that says, quote, the president may regulate importation by requiring importers to pay 10% of the value of goods to the Treasury. So I don't think you have to use any particular word. The question is in context, does
Algonquin didn't have anything like that, but keep going.
So Algonquin does have, I think, a context that's miles apart from what the government is seeking here to do with IEPA. So first of all, it is a common sense statute. I understand there's some rhetoric by common sense reading the statute. I know there's some rhetoric by the lawyer who stood here before, which is of course forgivable. But it was a statute about one product. 232 is article by article. It's one product. This is a billion products or even more that the government is seeking. The Algonquin was expressly a trade statute. It was the 1962 Trade Act. It's everything this case isn't. Algonquin had a specific reference to the word duties in a separate provision. Algonquin had a legislative history that was clear as day that the president was given this power. And I understand this court today doesn't look to legislative history, but the way Algonquin got to where it was by saying the legislative history, the chief sponsor of the act.
I think I'll disagree with you on that. It does a plain text and then says, is there anything in the legislative history to defeat the plain text? So I disagree pretty strongly with you on that, but it doesn't defeat your point. Keep going.
Okay, so I'd also say, maybe the most important point, 232, our argument is not just that you have to specifically authorize a tariff with some sort of word, but also that one way of understanding whether Congress is delegating its awesome tariff power, its awesome taxing power, is to ask, are there limits to what Congress has put in? And in Algonquin, in section 232, the court points to and goes painstakingly through all the limits. The first words of the decision are all about how constrained the statute is. It's a reticulated scheme. The cabinet secretaries have to make certain findings. There are specific statutory factors Congress says the president must look at before acting. There are public hearings. There are limited remedies, quote, to the extent necessary. All of that is in the statute. All of that is in the Algonquin opinion. None of it is in IEPA. That's the problem, and that's why, just like James and Moore, the Algonquin case said this is a very limited decision, limited just to the facts.
Thank you.
Justice Barrett?
So this license thing is important to me. And do you agree that pursuant to IEPA, the president could regulate commerce by imposing a license fee?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Could the president regulate commerce under IEPA by using a licensing fee?
Not a fee. So I should have said this earlier, but license is different from a licensing fee. IEPA and TWIA authorize licenses, not license fees, and no president has ever charged, to my knowledge, fees under those two statutes for the licenses. So fees impermissible, licenses are...
Fees permissible if they cover the costs of the scheme?
Might be. I mean, but once they start revenue raising, you implicate the most serious concerns.
But I thought you conceded to Justice Gorsuch there was no difference between a tariff and a licensing fee, functionally.
If the licensing fee is just to, I didn't concede that. If the licensing fee is just to recoup the cost of government services, I think that may be okay. I don't think you need to get into it. Here, the government is asserting a power which they say in their briefs to you raises $4 trillion.
So you understand the statute to permit licensing in the sense of permission. Like, we will not allow you to trade with us. We will not allow your goods to be imported unless we license it.
Absolutely. And Justice Barrett, I think just the natural reading, if you're to look at the word licenses and think, wow, Congress smuggled this incredible power to do all of these different things that the government is doing here, 39% taxes on some countries and others, through the word license.
Can you license exportation?
I don't think so, for the reason that,
Well, right now, I actually looked into this. I mean, I think you, maybe not licensing fees.
Exactly.
But could you license exportation, like saying we're not gonna allow certain products that have national security implications to be exported?
Yes.
So licensing could be used in that sense, not as a revenue nation measure.
Yes.
Okay. So you went back and forth with Justice Gorsuch about the implications of the president's authority over foreign affairs and whether the major questions doctrine applies. You say that in IEPA, the president's war powers are not implicated, and that was part of the reason why you say that we should think of this differently than some of the historical examples where the commander-in-chief war powers were implicated. But the same language appears in the Trading with the Enemies Act, in which war powers would be implicated. So do you think the language should be, and of course that is what President Nixon relied on. So do you think that the language would be interpreted differently in that context, even though the commander-in-chief power and the war power would be implicated?
100%, I think, would be interpreted differently. Justice Jackson.
Same regulate commerce language.
Yes, because once you're carrying over wartime precedents to peacetime.
Okay, I don't understand that then, because everybody agrees the language came in IEPA came from the Trading with the Enemy Act. So you're saying it has one meaning in the Trading with the Enemy Act and a different meaning in IEPA, that same regulate commerce?
No, I think that the conquered territory language and all of that may go to the president's Article 2 powers as inherent powers in conquered territory, but I don't think it gets the government where they need to go. The CAC brief and the brief by Professor Paul Stephen goes through and explains why in 1933, when Congress decided to bring these concepts into peacetime, it severed the wartime roots. And there's an extensive legislative history.
Okay, I understand that, but I thought that was about, maybe I'm just not tracking. I mean, I think there's been some discussion of whether the president would have inherent Article 2 authority in wartime to impose tariffs to this end. Is that what you're talking about? Are you actually talking about a statute that said regulate importation in wartime? And you think it could have the tariff power conferred through that language in a war-making statute, but not in IEPA?
No, I don't think it confers it in either place. I think the president, it's located, the president's power in conquered territories, not in the Trading with Enemies Act or anything like that.
Okay, so it's inherent constitutional power coming from the law of war. Okay. And then if you win, tell me how the reimbursement process would work. Would it be a complete mess? I mean, you're saying before the government promised reimbursement, and now you're saying, oh, that's rich, but how would this work? It seems to me like it could be a mess.
So the first thing I'd say is that just underscores just how major a question this is. The very fact that you were dealing with this with quotas, there's no refund process to the tunes of billions of dollars or embargoes, but there is here. But for our case, the way it would work is, in this case, the government stipulated for the 5 plaintiffs that they would get the refunds. So for us, that's how it would work. Your question, I take it, is about everyone else. We don't have a class action or anything like that. With respect to everyone else, there's a whole specialized body of trade law, and it's in 19 U.S.C. 1514 outlines all these administrative procedures. It's a very complicated thing. There's got to be an administrative protest. There was a harbor management case earlier that this court was involved with in the United States Shoe, in which the refund process took a long time. There were any number of claims and equitable relief.
So a mess.
So it's difficult, absolutely. We don't deny that it's difficult, but I think what this court has said in the McKesson case in 1990 is that serious economic dislocation isn't a reason to do something. Northern Pipeline, you guys stayed your decision for a while in order to let the congressional process unfold. There may be a congressional process here as well. You may be able to also be that this court could limit its decision to prospective relief under the John Q. Hemmings case. So there's lots of possibilities.
Justice Jackson?
So I think I read Algonquin differently than Justice Kavanaugh. When I look at its analysis, it absolutely doesn't.
Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the probiotics. You can get it in a powder form or a veggie cap form. This will help with your immune system at the gut level, improve your metabolism, also allow you to sleep better. By improving your gut biome, you're improving the communication between your gut and your liver and your gut and your brain. You'll be able to sleep better. You're going to be able to detoxify your central nervous system and consolidate memory. Having a good gut biome is super important for overall health. good health at the gut level is foundational for health. Please go to my store and get the great probiotics that I offer. Also, the complete multivitamin. This is very easy to digest. In addition, this has the multivitamins that you need as cofactors for enzymatic activity. And by taking this multivitamin every day, your enzymes will perform better at the cellular level. So therefore your tissues will perform better, your organ systems will perform better. And when you have better performing organ systems, your body will perform better and you're going to be slowing down the aging process. So the key to the foundational part of my protocol is to take the multivitamin that's easy to digest and the powdered probiotic or the veggie cap probiotic. That's the foundation. Then the first pillar on top of that foundation is the Max 35 or cleanse. That's going to improve your immune system. C60 is the second pillar. C60 will soak up free radicals. The third pillar is the turmeric, ashwagandha, and lignans to boost up your immune system and also help with your cardiovascular system and bring down inflammation at the brain level. Therefore, your brain function will improve. And the fourth pillar, boomer boost. Rev up that metabolism and increase your energy levels. If you pay attention to that protocol, you're going to notice that you're aging slower because you're targeting all the factors that are dealing with aging. Free radicals, less ATP, inflammation, you're targeting all those. So please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Use discount 5, you get $5 off any order. That's the end of my broadcast. Thank you for listening and have a nice day.